Kakak ya urutannya ya. Oke, aku play video ya. Play video 7 menit dan saya buang broadcast di 3, 2, 1 video play.
Indonesia merupakan negara dengan resiko bencana level medium. Bencana alam, non-alam, dan perubahan iklim berdampak serius terhadap pembangunan dan penurunan target kemiskinan. Pemerintah Indonesia berkomitmen untuk memastikan tidak ada yang tertinggal dalam proses pembangunan, termasuk masyarakat rentan dan mereka yang terdampak bencana. Untuk itu, dibutuhkan kebijakan nasional yang dapat memberikan perlindungan sosial yang adaptif bagi masyarakat, terutama pada situasi kedaruratan. Perlindungan sosial merupakan salah satu intervensi kebijakan yang dilakukan untuk mengatasi kemiskinan. Intervensi ini kemudian berkembang menjadi upaya untuk melindungi masyarakat yang terkena dampak bencana, baik yang disebabkan oleh alam maupun non-alam, agar tidak jatuh dalam kemiskinan. Perlindungan sosial yang mencakup kelompok rentan bencana ini dikenal dengan perlindungan sosial adaptif atau Adaptive Social Protection. ASP berupaya menghubungkan 3 aspek, yaitu perlindungan sosial, pengurangan resiko bencana, dan adaptasi perubahan iklim. Hal ini merupakan bagian dari upaya pencegahan, mitigasi, kesiapsiagaan, tanggap darurat, dan pemulihan pada tahap sebelum, saat, dan pasca bencana. Di tingkat nasional, ASP menjadi prioritas pembangunan dan telah masuk dalam RPJMN 2020-2024. Sementara di tataran daerah, ASP dimanifestasikan dalam berbagai program perlindungan sosial yang didanai oleh APBD sebagai bagian dari upaya respon terhadap bencana. Unicef dengan dukungan UN Joint Sustainable Development Goals bekerja bersama pemerintah nasional dan subnasional dalam membangun pondasi untuk ASP. Kerjasama untuk advokasi ASP di subnasional mencakup memberikan pendampingan dalam penyusunan kebijakan di level subnasional, Nusa Tenggara Barat, Nusa Tenggara Timur, Yogyakarta, untuk program pemulihan sosial saat kedaruratan. Menyelenggarakan peningkatan kapasitas daerah untuk ASP melalui penyusunan modul ASP, pelatihan untuk pemerintah provinsi, kabupaten, dan desa. Penguatan kapasitas pemerintah desa melalui penyusunan pedoman fasilitasi desa peduli iklim dan desa tanggap bencana.
Kami sangat berterima kasih dengan adanya FGD ini. Kita akan mencoba mengkolaborasikan apa yang sudah ada dari kabupaten dan masukan dari masyarakat maupun dari kelurahan, nanti itu akan disempurnakan di dalam perubahan peraturan yang membawa kepada pelaksanaan pelayanan di dalam bencana yang adaptif ini.
Jadi kami dari awal ya bersama masyarakat desa Bentek ini selalu melakukan kegiatan dalam rangka bagaimana mengamankan satu mata air. Karena mata air bagi kami adalah salah satu yang sangat vital yang harus kita selamatkan. Yang kedua, masyarakat yang tinggal dekat hutan wajib untuk menjaga hutan yang ada di sekitarnya. Dengan cara apa? Menanam tanaman yang bisa melindungi daripada struktur tanah yang bisa menimbulkan tanah longsor itu.
Salah satu manfaat dari ASP adalah peningkatan ketangguhan masyarakat terhadap bencana, krisis iklim, serta perlindungan menyeluruh pasca bencana kepada mereka yang terdampak. Kegiatan perwujudan ASP di daerah mencakup pemutakhiran data terhadap populasi yang terdampak bencana, penguatan kebijakan daerah untuk perlindungan sosial saat kedaruratan, pengurangan resiko bencana, dan adaptasi perubahan iklim termasuk kerjasama multi pihak, serta penganggaran yang adaptif.
Pemerintah Indonesia berkomitmen untuk menjalankan pembangunan yang inklusif, termasuk inklusif terhadap masyarakat rentan terdampak bencana. Salah satunya adalah mengembangkan perlindungan sosial yang adaptif. Perlindungan sosial yang adaptif melindungi masyarakat dari risiko jatuh miskin saat terjadi bencana, baik bencana alam maupun bencana ekonomi dan sosial. Perlindungan sosial yang adaptif berupaya menghubungkan 3 aspek penting, yaitu perlindungan sosial, pengurangan risiko bencana, dan adaptasi perubahan iklim. Program ini menjadi salah satu kebijakan yang tertuang dalam RPJM 2020-2024. Program ini merupakan program yang terintegrasi, mulai dari pusat sampai ke daerah, baik program pemerintah maupun sampai pada inisiatif yang dikembangkan di tingkat komunitas. Dalam tataran daerah, ASP diimplementasikan dalam berbagai program perlindungan sosial yang didanai oleh APBD sebagai upaya penanganan bencana di daerah. Kami harapkan pemerintah daerah dapat berpartisipasi aktif secara terintegrasi dengan sistem yang diciptakan di tingkat nasional.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to invite you to please be seated. We'd like to invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to please be seated. And for those who are still at the outside of this ballroom, we'd like to invite you to please enter the ballroom and please be seated. We are about to begin our program this morning shortly. Once again, good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, who are those still outside of this ballroom. We'd like to invite you to please enter the ballroom and please be seated. We are about to begin our program this morning shortly. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please strictly maintain health procedures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 by wearing your mask, washing your hands regularly, and keeping a safe distance. And also for the Q&A session, ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to raise your hand for comments or questions to the panelists. The committee will hand in the wireless microphone to you. And for our virtual audience, please kindly pay attention to the following rules for the event. First, kindly use the virtual background that you can find in the chat box. Second, for identification, please key in the username format, your country, followed by your institution, and followed by your name. And for the Q&A session, you can send your questions in the chat box with the following format, your name, followed by your institution, followed by your questions, addressed to whom, and followed by your questions. Thank you for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu. May peace be upon us. Shalom, Namaste, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Very good morning to all distinguished delegates of the third G20 Development Working Group side event. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Putu Desi Fridayanti, and it is an honor for me to be the MC for today's program. Praise to the presence of God Almighty because of His blessings. In this very precious moment, we can all meet at the third G20 Development Working Group side event, a call to action for G20 countries, adaptive social protection for building resilience and protecting human capital. And allow me to greet the Honorable Deputy Minister for Development Funding, Ministry of National Development Planning or BAPPENAS, Mr. Snyder Klasin Hasudungan Siahaan. Honorable Representative Unicef at Interim, Mr. Robert Gass. Ms. Natalia Winderossi, Director of Social Policy and Social Protection, our distinguished moderators and panelists, and all our respected delegations, and audiences joining us in person and through online platform. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let's commence today's event with the opening remarks from Honorable Deputy Minister for Development Funding Ministry of National Development Planning or BAPPENAS. We'd like to invite to please come up to the stage Mr. Snyder Klasin Hasudungan Siahaan to deliver the opening remarks. Please come up to the stage.
Yang kami hormati Bapak Taufik Hanafi, Sekretaris Kementerian Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional BAPPENAS, dan kami hormati Deputi dari BAPPENAS yang hadir pada saat ini, Mr. Robert Grass, Unicef Representative, and Ms. Natalia Winderossi, Director Social Policy and Social Protection from Unicef, and Honorable Distinguished G20 delegates, participants, ladies and gentlemen, all the audience that attend this meeting. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, dan salam kebajikan. I'm pleased to join you all today at the G20 Development Working Group side event here in Bali. Welcome to Bali. Welcome back again to Indonesia. It is a great pleasure for me to see some familiar faces of the delegates again in our home. I hope you have enough rest after a year-long journey, and the series of our G20 side events will kick off and provide a warm-up for our third DWG meeting on Wednesday. Our highest appreciation to UNICEF colleagues from the Indonesian country office and also the headquarters, Pak Robert, Ibu Natalia, and the team, who have excellently arranged such timely dialogue to advance G20 contributions to the adaptive social protection implementation and dissemination to broader audiences to public through these side events. As you may be aware, this is our first side event session from a total 9 G20 side events in 2 days, as the result of collaborations with various development partners as the part of the third meeting of the Development Working Group. Dear colleagues, as we speak, countries around the world are grappling with soaring food and energy prices. The recent estimates by UNDP points out that these situations could push an additional 71 million people into poverty, almost double the amount of people falling to poverty due to COVID-19 consequences. Such global market disruption is unprecedented, magnifying the inequality between and within countries, depending on their capacity in responding to shocks and coping capacity. These alarming situations call for global address, compel us to reassess our approach in immediate mitigation strategies and effective protection policies in the face of shocks. It goes without saying that for many, the absence of social protection measures could intensify their poverty level. However, for many developing countries and least developed countries, they may not be able to weather the crisis appropriately without global support. Therefore, we need to mobilize support in accelerating the development and expansion of social protection. This recent crisis should be considered a wake call to establish a social protection system that can help the poor and vulnerable communities. Ladies and gentlemen, the Indonesian presidency believes that to devise robust social protection that is adaptive to shocks, we need to unpack the key elements of adaptive social protection, departing from the root causes and operationalization. The Indonesia G20 DWG presidency, therefore, will focus on promoting the role of adaptive social protection as a pathway toward stronger recovery and resilience. There are 4 elements I wish to highlight. Firstly, identifying existing social protection. Identifying the current system will help countries to better differentiate which part of their social protection system needs to be tweaked and improved in order for the mechanism of social protection programs to become smooth and responsive in facing multiple shocks. Accordingly, provision of comprehensive data information is essential. Having the system in place can help feed better social registry data sets or socioeconomic statistical data to extend ASP coverage to reach at-risk populations and pinpoint priority areas or vulnerable and high-risk households. Data utilization can also be beneficial in facilitating operational efficiency in delivering timely benefits. Additionally, institutional arrangement and program design for adaptive social protection is necessary. Having policies dedicated to supporting ASP implementation will be beneficial for coordinating synergies among different organizations and ensuring the implementation of social protection is not an ad hoc basis. Finally, without a proper financing mechanism, social protection will not be sustainable. Risk financing strategies and innovative financings, such as disaster and climate risk financing, could be used by governments to prepare and strengthen their financial capability to address the consequences of disasters prior to the actual events. Both involve pre-planning and pre-aligning of financial resources dedicated to both emergency and long-term funding. Dear colleagues, we are humbled that our collaborative work between the Indonesian presidency and UNICEF allowed us to advance the discussion on adaptive social protections, continuing our fruitful discussion in the first DWG in Jakarta and second DWG in Yogyakarta. I hope UNICEF could continue the hard work to also support the implementation of the actions and commitments that we discussed and agreed in the G20 Development Working Group, not only in the ESP, but on the other related priority areas related to the recovery and resilience. We hope this spirit resonates with our G20 DWG colleagues, where it could lead to broad endorsement on the G20 roadmap for stronger resilience and recovery. Finally, I would like to thank once again for the collaboration of our various stakeholders in the Ministry of National Development Planning and development partners to present us with a series of side events to the third Development Working Group. I am proud to inform you that these side events are collaborative works with more than 20 development partners, government stakeholders, and other institutions. I thank you for all the hard works, and I believe that the side events will provide us with broader perspectives and new insights that later on help us our discussion and negotiation in the DWG meeting. I thank you all, and I wish you have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Mrs. Snyder, for your opening remarks. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, now we will have a welcoming remarks from the representative of UNICEF Indonesia at interim, Mr. Robert Gas. Mr. Robert Gas, time is yours.
Selamat pagi, Bapak Snyder Klasen Hasudung Bensiahan, Deputy Minister for Development Funding of BAPPENAS, Ibu Siliwanti, Director of Multilateral Department, BAPPENAS, Bapak Maliki, Director for Poverty Alleviation and Community Empowerment with BAPPENAS,
Bapak Yanuar Nugroho, Coordinator for the Expert Team for the National Secretariat of SDGs Indonesia, distinguished guests, delegates of the G20 Development Working Group, including officials from the government of Indonesia, social protection stakeholders from G20 countries, delegates from the governments of the Dominican Republic, Malawi, and Mongolia, development practitioners, civil society organizations, universities and think tanks, experts from the World Bank, European Commission, and UN colleagues, other distinguished guests, a very good morning to you all. It is a great honor, and I'm delighted to be here with you today for this morning's side event entitled A Call to Action for G20 Countries, Adaptive Social Protection for Building Resilience and Protecting Human Capital. I gratefully acknowledge the commitment of each of your countries for attending this session. Your participation will enrich our discussions. I would also like to express my deep appreciation to BAPPENAS, the Ministry of National Development Planning for Indonesia, for co-convening this important event with UNICEF. Their leadership in designing this session has been invaluable. I would like to similarly express my appreciation to the World Bank and European Commission for joining our session to share their expertise. I'm confident that all participants will appreciate the information they have to share. Finally, a very special thanks to those countries who are sharing their valuable experiences in implementing adaptive social protection programs and from whom we are eager to learn, namely Malawi, Mongolia, and the Dominican Republic. Thank you. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented social and economic challenges for countries across the world, reversing many years of progress. This has been clearly made evident by the additional 125 million people who fell below the international poverty line of incomes of less than $1.9 a day in 2020. These reported numbers, however, may in reality understate the situation facing millions of families across the world, a fact that further underscores the importance of today's session. Children have been disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic. According to UNICEF colleagues, over 350 million children, or 1 in 6, are living under conditions of extreme poverty, and about 1 billion children are multidimensionally poor. And due to the COVID pandemic, an additional 100 million children have fallen into multidimensional poverty. These children have already been and will likely be further deprived of education, nutrition, healthcare, and child protection, the preconditions for them to reach their full potential if we do not choose to act. Therefore, we are here today to discuss adaptive child responsive social protection, an important policy instrument which focuses on reducing vulnerability while simultaneously building the resilience or ability of households and children to prepare for, to cope with, and adapt to shocks. But for this to happen, there are certain steps we all need to consider. First, adaptive social protection systems should be based on sound evidence, which includes a contextualized analysis of risks and shocks, regular monitoring, impact evaluations, and costing exercises. The systems developed should have the capacity to address chronic poverty, life cycle-based vulnerabilities, and shocks during cyclical and protracted emergencies, including humanitarian situations. It will also be important to reinforce political commitment at all levels of governance and ensure increased investment in child-responsive social protection to reduce poverty and vulnerability and the impact of shocks, to ensure children's access to basic social services that are critical for them to grow to their full potential. We've understood that a 1% increase in GDP in spending for social protection can reduce poverty by between 4 and 13%. We also know that every dollar of investment in social protection can bring a return of up to $2.50 in low and middle income countries. These are not small numbers. We also need to promote an integrated administration or institutional structure of social protection systems. This means that social protection institutions need to be equipped with adequate skilled human resources, with relevant communication strategies, social or single registries with robust management information systems, and efficient delivery mechanisms. We will be hearing about all of these more today in our conversation. I'm looking forward to listening to our presenters today and to learn more about how some countries have successfully built their adaptive social protection systems by applying essential aspects of sound systems that have been globally recommended. Implementing these context-specific and evidence-led actions and policies will help ensure that children are able to return to a normal life and have access to basic social services while taking into consideration and hopefully also reversing the impacts of COVID-19. Children hold the key to change and development. We must invest in systems that protect them and promote their ability to reach their full potential. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, there's no better time than now for countries to strengthen child-responsive, adaptive social protection systems, to reinforce economic growth, to reduce poverty and the associated multiple deprivations, and to protect human capital. UNICEF wishes to join with all of you in meeting this challenge by making social protection systems adaptive and child-responsive to ensure children are able to thrive in this dynamically changing and challenging world. Let me thank again the government of Indonesia for their vision and leadership as president of the G20 in advancing this critically important policy approach to benefit children, to benefit their families, and to benefit communities globally. I'd like to wish all G20 delegates and experts from other countries and development partners a fruitful side event. Thank you and terima kasih.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that was the welcoming remark from Mr. Gus as the representative of UNICEF Indonesia at interim. And now we will come to the presentation and panel discussion session, ladies and gentlemen. So to start this first panel discussion with the theme Adaptive Social Protection for Building Resilience and Protecting Human Capital, allow me to begin with introduce the short introduction for our moderator. Our moderator for first panel discussion is Mr. Maliki. Mr. Maliki has been working in BAPPENAS for more than 20 years. Currently, he is appointed as Director for Poverty Alleviation and Community Empowerment since 2019. With background as engineer, he earned his doctoral degree in Economic of Population in University of Hawaii at Manoa. And his portfolio is to design policy recommendation for development of social protection program, community empowerment program, and social welfare and rehabilitation program, especially for disadvantaged children population, older persons, and people with disability. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on the stage our moderator, Mr. Maliki.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, Shalom. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yang terhormat Pak Sestama, Pak Taufik, Pak Snyder, Pak Robert Gas, somewhere in Jakarta, I think, and also Bu Yoshimi. And greetings to everyone. Welcome to our seminar, a call to action for building adaptive social protection, for building resilience and also protecting human capital. So here we are in Bali Nusa Dua Convention Center, Bali in Indonesia. My name is Maliki, Director for Poverty Alleviation and Community Empowerment, and I am the moderator for this first session. For this session, we will have like 4 speakers. And here in persons will be there 2 speakers. One is from the UNICEF and also one is from the World Bank. I think I'm going to call Ibu Natalia from New York, UNICEF New York. and also and the second speaker is from the World Bank, Ibu Sarah Yonazi. There will be speakers that present in Zoom. There is Bu. Hold on. Bapak, hold on. Wow. Ibu Suti and also Ibu Suti. Ibu Suti and also Mr. Massimo from ECO European Community. And for a few backgrounds for our station, we have our experience in the pandemic COVID that, again, it is proven that the social protection systems become the most critical points, the critical pillar for responding to the pandemic COVID for the social impact crisis. So, but there is some highlights, gaps, that is still ingrained in our social protection system, such as that we still have to address the coverage, the inclusion, as well as the ability of the social protections into responding of this crisis in a timely manner. So therefore, I think as what Pak Robert Guest and also Pak Snyder mentioned, the adaptive social protection become a very critical point that we have to build, so then we can respond to our future COVID risk that induced by the natural disaster, as well as the climate change, and also political conflicts, and such like this pandemic, disease outbreaks. So therefore, today, we are going to have a discussion on how importance of this adaptive social protection, and then we are going to also discuss on how we can build more sustainable financing mechanisms to implement this adaptive social protection. So our first speaker is Ibu Natalia Winderossi, is currently Director for Social Policy and Social Protection at Unicef headquarters in New York. She leads Unicef social policy programming at the global level and oversees the organization work on child poverty, social protection, public finance management for children, and local governance. So Ibu Natalia will present how important the adaptive social protection in protecting especially children during the crisis. Ibu Natalia, you have 15 minutes, and the screen and floors are yours.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to check that everybody can hear me okay. Great, thank you. So good morning, afternoon, and evening. Honorable Deputy Minister, G2 delegates, G20 delegates, partners, guests, it's an honor for UNICEF and personally for me to be here with all of you in this very timely and critical side event. In this presentation, I really wanted to highlight some of the critical elements of why social protection, and particularly adapted, risk-informed, shock-responsive social protection has to be a critical pillar as we start thinking about inclusive recovery. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as highlighted by Robert, unfortunately, we are in a very critical moment. We know that as a result of conflict, climate change, but also COVID, we now have an unprecedented number of new people that have fallen into poverty. And when we're looking at the figures of children living in poverty, we know that at least 100 million children are now living in multidimensional poverty as of last year. And this is something that is impacting low-income countries, but also middle-income countries and high-income countries. Child poverty is not just an issue for low-income context, but it's a global priority and a global urgency issue for all of us. And there's two critical points here. One is not only that it's an additional number, an aggregate number of new children that are falling into poverty, but also new profiles of children. In other words, children that had not experienced poverty before, that were able to lift themselves out of poverty with their families, now are falling into poverty traps. This is children, for example, in urban areas, in fragile contexts, in humanitarian contexts, in middle-income countries, children whose families work in the informal sector or in others. It is a poverty, but also a care crisis, where women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the crises, and where we're seeing more and more the need to have a much more adequate and gender-sensitive approach to recovery. At the same time, even before the pandemic, we saw that there was a lot of gaps in terms of how we were able to finance our SDGs, particularly when we're looking at social sectors. And of course, it has been exacerbated by the mounting crisis, but also by all the debt repayments that many countries are forced to start making in the current context. Next slide, please. We know very much from our evidence and work that social protection is a proven strategy for reducing child poverty. We know it from the multiple evidence that we've been able to develop by Unicef, but also by the bank and other partners, so how important social protection is to reduce poverty, to enhance food security, but also to contribute to addressing some of the financial access barriers across different sectors, such as education, health, nutrition, and others. We also know that has a very important impact in terms of inclusion, in terms of gender and disability and others. We know that it's a recognized strategy to address climate and conflict-related risk, and this has been recognized with multiple of our global commitments across the board. And that is particularly useful and important for the poorest and more vulnerable, but not only. COVID has made very clear that social protection is not only relevant for the poor, but for everybody. It's a right, it's a risk management strategy, and it's essential to be part of our inclusive recovery process. Next slide. And we also know that it has been a critical pillar of the COVID response. We know an unprecedented response from many governments that were struggling with fiscal space, but that would put forth their political commitment and understanding that they had to use their existing systems to provide the most needed support to many communities, children, and families. Cash transfers were one of the most used response, but not only. Many other types of social protection instruments provided a critical lifeline in a very complicated context. And I think this was confirming two things. One, that government systems are able to respond when there's political will, when there's the appropriate mechanisms, they're able to support. Also the need to have other types of complementary interventions when some people are not protected or covered by programs. But also confirming the important protective role that social protection has in terms of addressing income and employment losses, in terms of addressing some of the new out-of-pocket health costs, but also helping families not to make the impossible choices versus, abiding those social distances versus going to work and meeting ends meet. Next slide. But even with this very important and positive situation, we also know that the crisis was very clear in putting on the table that we still have a lot of very critical gaps in the social protection architecture across regions. One, in terms of coverage. And just to give you an example, only 1 in 4 children are effectively covered by social protection, and this is before the pandemic. So we still have a very strong coverage gap. If we want to see results, we need to make sure that there is coverage across the board. But also in terms of adequacy, we still are facing challenges to really adequately and systematically integrate many populations that are systematically excluded from these programs: girls, women, children with disabilities, children on the move, and designing programs that are really addressing the very specific vulnerabilities that these populations face. So it's not just about blanket coverage, but also specific, targeted, and adequate type support. And of course, the very important gap in terms of financing. We know that countries have made extraordinary efforts to make sure that social protection is a priority in their budgets, but we still know that there is a big gap to make sure that these programs are institutionalized and sustainably financed across the board. And one critical, I think, lesson which brings us together back to our side event is the importance of having risk-informed programming as part of our design of social protection programs. So seeing risk risk design, adaptive social protection, shock responsive social protection, not as an afterthought, not as a new additional element, but part of good programming where we're designing and implementing social protection programs. Next slide, please. And what do we mean by adaptive social protection? And by no means I'm going to try and make a definition, but basically, for us in UNICEF, it's really making sure that we're doing good programming, meaning that we are systematically integrating elements of risk when we're designing and we're implementing social protection. It's a system that effectively responds to shocks and crises when they happen, but they're also helping them to cope and better respond and to prepare to many of the shocks that we know unfortunately are predictable. And progressively help families to recover and build resilience. We know in the current context, there's no other way of doing good programming. We know that humanitarian crises are on the rise. It's the new norm, unfortunately. And the complexity of this crisis is allowing us to integrate that risk dimension in however we're designing our programs. Social programs, economic programs, environmental programs, and social protection should not be the exception. Next slide. UNICEF has a new strategic plan that we launched this year where we revamped and put again at the center of our commitment our work around social protection with a specific pillar to make sure that every child has access to inclusive social protection and lives free of poverty, where the work on preparedness and shock responsive social protection is a critical element of that response. And this is putting on the table and at the service of many of our government partners our comprehensive approach, our ability to be able to help governments in building systems that are risk-informed and shock responsive, but also to be able to have the operational capacity to respond even when those systems do not exist and learn from those interventions to build more important risk-informed approaches. Next slide. We work across the different, the nexus, working in countries where systems do not exist and building humanitarian response that eventually can lead into some systems approach. In contexts where systems are emerging and we need to integrate those dimensions, working together to integrate not only social and economic dimensions, but also climate and conflict risk dimensions. But also in those systems that are mature, making sure that they're more agile, more responsive, better able to cover affected populations and will really be used as the asset that they are, as critical systems to provide support. Next slide. And I think one important commitment is within UNICEF core commitments for children, social protection is being for the first time integrated as one of the critical sectors to influence our work in humanitarian contexts. And this revamps our commitment to make sure that we have a much more stronger coordination between our humanitarian emergency response and our work and development, bringing really into practice what we mean by working on the nexus. Providing adequate support, as I said, to the working of existing systems, to supporting national systems to be more agile, but also to enhance the venues and the spaces and the mechanisms for active community participation. We know that a lot of the resilience mechanisms happen at community level. How can we bring them and really make sure that we take advantage of that expertise to also influence the better development of our governments and national systems? Next slide. I won't go into detail into the different examples because I think we have the pleasure of having 3 great countries that can show what does it mean to do this in practice. But just this slide is to show the broad range of interventions, that there's no one model to do adaptive social protection, that we need to understand the context, what is the maturity of the systems, what are the kinds of things that we need to influence to make sure that we have a proper response. And that this is possible not only in well-established, mature systems, but also in contexts where there is ongoing conflict, when there's an ongoing emergency, and we can take advantage of our humanitarian response to build a strong work and medium-term responses. Next slide. Let's go to the next one, please. The next one, please. One last point I wanted to make is that even though we understand the importance of social protection, even though we all as a collective have recognized its importance. And as I said, COVID was very clear in putting that on the table and making social protection a key part of the response. We still have a long road ahead in prioritizing it as one of the elements that we need to consciously and effectively and ambitiously finance. We are unfortunately in a process of potentially unequal recovery, where some countries still are starting to think about recovery, but not everybody. We still have countries that have limited access to preventive measures, to ways of addressing the gaps in many social sectors. And we need to continue to put social protection, in addition to health and education and others, at the center of our inclusive recovery priorities. This is something and a commitment that I know should come up of this week's discussions, that as we're talking about climate financing, as we're talking about sustainable recovery, we need to continue to acknowledge the importance of human capital, human capabilities, and the importance of having mechanisms such as social protection at the core of our priority strategies. It's not just about thinking of social protection as a short-term band-aid or a short-term response, but that really addresses and helps to build resilient and inclusive recovery. And this is really making the case of investing in preparedness and system building, not only on response. Putting human capabilities back at the center alongside climate and green recovery. And also making sure that we have the best mechanisms to integrate different policies. One example of this move is the Secretary General priority in the Common Agenda around the Global Accelerator for Social Protection and Jobs, which really brings to the table the importance of having a conscious effort between different UN agencies, IFIs, and partners to really make sure that we have an element of acceleration and of an expansion of coverage and financing around social protection. As I said, not only as an emergency response, but as a pillar of recovery, as a pillar of sustainable financing. Next slide, please. And along those lines, last year, Unicef launched a call for action in terms of what we should prioritize in terms of inclusive recovery. And even though we are in a very complex context with multiple competing priorities, for us it was important to make 3 big points. One, that even in a context of economic crisis, we need to make sure that we're protecting social spending, even in economic downturn moments. The budgets for children should be the last in line to be cut, will be the first to be protected, and making sure that children are not asked to pay twice for the cost of crisis and recovery. So it's about protecting existing allocations and making sure that these are ring-fenced in the context of cuts. At the same time, making sure that we are helping and working alongside with governments and partners to enhance the efficiency, the efficacy, the transparency, and the equity of the existing interventions. And we in UNICEF, we work very closely with many of you, many governments and many partners in making sure that that happens within the social protection sector, but also across the different social sectors. And in that way, really make sure that we can find the additional and the important fiscal space to address some of the many gaps that I put on the table, but also the elements that need to be constantly reinforced in terms of preparedness and investment in responses. But also being conscious that we need to also identify new financing mechanisms. We're asking governments to do more and better with the same existing resources, and that means that we need to also, as a collective, put on the table new innovative approaches, which I know my colleague from the bank and others will address, that can bring more domestic financing, but also the better involvement of the private sector, stronger public partnerships, as well as addressing some of the complicated elements that we have, particularly around the debt structure that we have today. So as my last slide, and I think I'm good in time, good. Next slide, please. So I think in this presentation, the attempt was to do 2 things. One is to reiterate and continue to be very clear on the role that social protection has, that it's not just a short-term emergency response, but it has to be seen as a right and as a pillar of inclusive recovery. That despite its critical role, social protection, unfortunately, has not always translates into more investment and scale. That this is a critical moment where we need to reverse that, and we need to make sure that we put social protection at the center of our inclusive recovery commitments. That we need to have critical alignment between development financing, climate financing, and humanitarian financing, and bring that together under one whole umbrella, where social protection is a critical entry point for that alignment. Prioritizing investments in system strengthening and preparedness, not just response. It's something easier and more important, and sometimes seen that we need to focus on responding, but I think it's equally critical, and definitely the payoff is much more stronger when we start putting resources in making sure that systems exist, the systems have ample coverage, the systems are risk-informed, and are able to therefore become the best venue and the best instrument for critical support. Making sure that we also have the ability to manage risks. We are in many contexts where climate conflict, but also other types of contexts, can jeopardize how we are working at national level. And we need to make sure that that is strengthened, as well as the capacity of local actors, local governments, local structures, in provide the best support to our communities. And I think sometimes we don't make that very clear link between capacities at national level, but also the very critical capacities at subnational and local levels. These are actors, the ones that are closer to children and to families, and are providing most of the direct support in the support in the context of crises. And I think that even though we have a lot of experience and evidence on how to make existing systems more adaptive and more shock responsive, we still have a lot to learn on how to build these systems from scratch. How do we take advantage of the humanitarian action experience to build systems that are risk-informed and shock responsive? How do we leverage the opportunities put forth around digital technologies to make sure the programs are accessible but also more effectively delivered? And how to really make sure that we are not excluding populations, but on the contrary, that we're systematically making sure that those that are left alone, left behind, are part of these interventions and therefore impact their lives. I'm going to stop here, next slide, and thank you very much to all of you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. It's very timely manner. You saved around 3 minutes. As I summarize from what Natalie already presented, here is that we need to emphasize that the social protections, adaptive social protection is very relevant for everyone. And it is also have to be prepared, not only respond. And ASP also is part of the integrated, how we can integrate the risk and prepare for the good programming here. Next, we have the second presenters. We have 2 experts from the World Bank. The first presenter will be Sarah Gionazi. And Sarah is joined the World Bank in 2007. She's a senior social protection specialist in social protection and jobs global practice of the World Bank. And then the second presenter, Ibu Sumati Rajput, financial sector specialist in the crisis and disaster risk finance team in the World Bank Group. And she has experience managing trust fund as well as working on the World Bank project in Asia, Africa, and Caribbean. Sarah and Ibu Sumati will emphasize on the importance of having sustainable financing mechanisms. I think Sarah will start first. Yes. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Pa Maliki. Selamat pagi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting us here today. In the spirit of really ensuring close collaboration between financing and social protection, Sumati and I will be sharing this presentation. The idea is really to find ways to connect financing strategies to programming for adaptive social protection. I think we can start with the first slide, please. So in his introduction, Pak Schneider was very, I think, clear in outlining some of the 4 building blocks we like to call of adaptive social protection. And today we will focus on one of them. So traditionally we like to think of the 4 building blocks as data, delivery systems, which are key, and of course institutions and partnerships. But we want to focus on financing here today, mostly because we think that financing is a very critical element as it helps us address one major challenge of adaptive social protection, which is having a timely response. We know that very often when crises hit, we scramble to identify needs, identify people that need to receive financing, and then to raise the adequate resources or reallocate them within the budget, sometimes drawing away from key investments. And so adaptive social protection and risk financing together through proper planning can help protect key investments, particularly in human development and productive assets, and increase the speed and the predictability of response. And we know that this is important for long-term goals, not only for the immediate protection that comes. So I think one point we really want to emphasize is how disaster risk financing per se is more than just financing. It's a much broader umbrella that really speaks to a global shift in seeing disasters and shocks as unpredictable humanitarian crisis, but actually something that can be, to some extent, predicted, planned for, and managed in ways that can mitigate the impact on the most vulnerable people. So next slide, please. I think we have seen, I don't know if you can see the small font on these slides, but I think many of us have experienced and know from different global events how when we don't have financial protection in the aftermath of a crisis or disaster, many negative impacts can be felt across the board. So we know that households and individuals resort to negative coping strategies, drawing down from the limited assets that they might have, pulling children from school, not going to medical services, and all of these have a much longer term impact in addition to the immediate welfare shock. And we know that governments have to shift resources quickly, sometimes away from key investments and key services and social services. And that all of this significantly increases and multiplies the economic impact and the welfare impact on people. I think next slide, please. So today we will go through 4 core principles of disaster risk finance, and Sumati, who is much more experienced on the financing side than myself, will go through these. But essentially, we want to highlight 4 points. The first I've already mentioned a little bit is the timeliness of finding. The importance of making sure that we have funds when we need them, not before. Sometimes the needs for financing are different in different moments of a shock. The importance of having ways to reach people effectively. So having those funds available is of little use if we cannot really reach those that need them in a quick fashion and in a predictable fashion. Sometimes not knowing that you can count on support makes you resort to strategies that you would otherwise be able to forego. Third, that no single financial instrument can address all risks. And this is very important because it means that we need to think about multiple channels and multiple ways to prepare. And finally, the data. Data is key. I'm from the World Bank, where they make us say this, but it's actually true. We know that in absence of proper information, it's very hard to estimate the potential impact of a disaster or of a shock. And so relying on multiple data sources, both at the household level, but also on past disasters, past crises, is really the only way we can start to kind of estimate beforehand the impact of a shock and help us plan the financial resources needed. And then decide on the best instrument to raise those or to identify those within our budget or otherwise. So with this, I will just hand it over to Sumati, who will walk us through each one of these, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Ibu Sumati, can you join?
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you, but okay.
Selamat
Yes.
pagi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me for this discussion today. It's really an honor to be able to be here with all of you, and I'm very sorry to not be there in person. So as Sarah already outlined broadly what the main principles of risk financing are, I'm going to walk you through them in a slightly more detailed manner. So really, when she was talking about, for example, the timeliness of funding, this graph on the screen should demonstrate what she referred to. So there's different points in time, different financing is needed at different points in time of an emergency. Typically, when there's a shock, the focus, of course, of governments is typically to respond to the immediate needs. Often this is, food and shelter and, making sure that basic amenities are provided to the populations that are affected. And this is something that actually is quite systematic across most shocks and something that governments actually tend to at least want to plan for. And then there's the phase of the recovery, which is enabling more kind of stability within the populations. And here there's a larger, and this applies to populations as well as the economy, and larger sums of resources are typically required for these types of activities. And of course, the final phase is reconstruction. And this is where, the larger pot of money is necessary, which is building back better. Of course, it's not like this is as systematic as it's presented on this slide. Many a time you need to build a bridge in order to make sure that people can actually have their livelihoods back. And so there are cross-cutting expenditures, but it's often daunting to have to think about planning everything all at once. So there are ways in which you can plan so that it's a bit more manageable, and then associate financing needs along with that planning mechanism. Next slide, please. Now, with timeliness, there are a few other dimensions that governments typically tend to consider, particularly while planning the instruments that they want to access. So, of course, there's the element of speed, there's the element of reliability, and then there's the element of cost or cost effectiveness. So typically, when governments want to rely on the humanitarian systems that exist, there's, of course, the aspect of not knowing exactly when the money will be available and not knowing how much money will be available. When governments think about loans for reconstruction, there's the aspect of, maybe the loans will come, but they often take time because there's negotiation involved with partners, and they can be costly instruments because they need to be repaid over time. There's the kind of what we call the risk transfer instruments, which are more insurance-like mechanisms. And often these can be designed in a manner that they trigger based on pre-agreed thresholds. So while they can be quick, there's often the element of cost because these typically require, for example, annual payments that governments need to make to access these instruments. And then often there is a question of reliability because they're very specifically designed. So they respond to specific perils and they respond to specific thresholds. So whenever these perils or thresholds are not, so to speak, met, they don't trigger, and that can often add confusion or create a sense of unreliability. But it often has to do with also a full understanding of what instrument is triggered when. Next slide, please. So the second principle really is perhaps the most important one, which is once money is available, how does it go where it needs to go? And typically when we talk to governments, some of the things that we hear repeatedly are that the reason, we've got access to the money, we have to decide what to do with the money and how it should reach, the populations that it's supposed to reach or the contractors that it's supposed to reach. And these kinds of elements can actually be predetermined. So there are ways in which, finance can be pre-assigned to emergency activities. There are ways in which the delivery channels can be pre-established. Shock responsive social protection, of course, is one of the main ways in which money can be channeled to beneficiaries. And in order to do that, of course, specifically for SP, and we tried to make this quite specific for adaptive social protection, it's important to understand how beneficiary registries can be developed or tweaked. It's important to understand how the payment modalities around through which money can be channeled to beneficiaries, and it's very important, of course, to also have ways in which you can track or monitor whether or not funds are reaching the beneficiaries that they're envisioned to reach. So these kinds of, given that countries have a whole wealth of understanding responding to disasters for many, many, many decades, actually many of these activities can be done in advance so that when money is available, it doesn't actually sit in government accounts, but can flow through very quickly. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to present the example of Sierra Leone, though I understand there's going to be very detailed discussions on country-specific examples that will follow this particular session. But just to give you a quick snapshot of how finance in Sierra Leone is linked to the adaptive social protection mechanism. So on one hand, something that the first thing the country has done actually to try and make shock responsive social protection more systematic is to start to link it directly to contingent resources. So the country actually started pre-COVID to start to think about this and set aside $4 million which are earmarked particularly for emergency cash transfer response so that they can be mobilized when there's a shock. The second thing that they worked on was to develop an emergency response manual that outlines the rules of the game, which is, identifying what perils they want to track in order to respond when there's a shock, developing a decision-making trigger that would eventually evolve into an objective, more data-driven trigger, developing ways or thinking through ways in which they could expand and tweak their existing beneficiary database. Also thinking through what potential benefit values could be based on prior experience, and then identifying the best payment modalities, based on experience with both digital mechanisms as well as manual. The third principle of their particular shock response is also around staying flexible. So even though they have the rules of the game, but being able to adapt quickly to the type of peril and the type of context. And this has actually led the country to have slightly different types of responses, but responses to different events. The safety net is scaled up for Ebola, for landslides that were in 2017, as well as most recently for the COVID-19 pandemic, where actually they were able to mobilize emergency cash transfers within three weeks of the emergency declaration. And the last principle that they're focusing on is really trying to think through how to link their sort of safety net to longer term financial planning and coordination. And there's two elements here. One is definitely coordination on the ground with stakeholders, including Ministry of Finance and the National Disaster Management Agency in those conversations, because of course for sustainable financing mechanisms, counterparts like Ministry of Finance play a key role. And the second one really is following the government's plan on developing their risk finance strategy so that they could link the safety net mechanism to instruments beyond the contingency reserves that they are holding. So for example, if the country decides to set up a contingency fund, if the country decides to set up a risk transfer instrument, how can the social safety net conversation be a part of that dialogue as well? Next slide, please. Now, at the beginning, Sarah mentioned that no one instrument can address all risks. And in the previous slide, I mentioned how Sierra Leone is thinking about their own risk finance strategy. So typically when countries want to make sure that they have a multitude of instruments to address the different risks they face, they adopt what is referred to as a risk layering mechanism. And this is perhaps a slide that many of you have seen before, particularly our counterparts in Indonesia who have their own risk finance strategy as well. But for the benefit of anybody who's new to this conversation, typically the way to think through this daunting task of trying to address the financial impacts that disasters impose, there's ways in which to plan for that. There's instruments that are specifically targeted to events that are smaller in magnitude, but perhaps higher in frequency. So for example, taking the case of Sierra Leone, they know that they have floods every year in the monsoon season from June to August. So there's some level of pre-planning that can be done to address those types of events, and often this can be done within existing budget mechanisms. The second type of event is, event that's probably slightly greater magnitude. For example, Indonesia faces, massive earthquakes very regularly every few years. And so there's instruments like contingent financing that can be put in place to respond to that. Now, the reason why these types of instruments typically are for events of higher magnitude are because they do come with a cost. Often the cost is policy priorities that development partners might impose. Often they could also be loans that need to be repaid over a certain period of time. Now, there's obviously events that are of very large magnitude that governments don't want to budget for because they don't occur very frequently, and also they impose very, very high expenditures. And so these are often events that governments prefer to transfer the risk for to international markets or to their domestic markets, where domestic markets are able to take on that risk. And these are market-based instruments or insurance instruments, which again are planned for big events because they are costly instruments. Typically, they require annual premium payments, given the sum that governments want to insure. And then there are 4 different groups of and categories of entities. It could be the government, it could be populations. And yes,
you have 4 more minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of the Philippines risk finance strategy. I won't go into it in depth because I explained a lot of the different types of instruments, but this is just to give you a demonstration of how countries can actually put in place a number of different instruments to address their financing needs. Next slide, please. Now, data, which is the fourth principle, is absolutely fundamental. In order to be able to plan, in order to be able to quantify the risk that you want to protect, in order to be able to put in place appropriate instruments that correspond to that, it's very important to have historical information. It's very important to have analytics that can translate that into some kind of meaningful decision-making that countries can make. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to scalability, I think we have partners who've talked a lot about this, but it's absolutely critical to understand what you're working with, what the risk profile for a region is, decide on the policy priorities, design the scalability trigger mechanism, which outlines the rules of the game, quantify the cost to the extent possible, finalize that through a risk finance strategy, and then really find ways to monitor and track how the system will work. Next slide, please. Now, just a few lessons to take away from some of the experiences that we've seen with countries on the ground. So really, I mean, it's important to, like I said, have the data that you need in order to estimate what volume of financing would be required in order to have the safety net scale up. It's important to link the safety net to pre-arranged financing, linking that with the existing government planned interventions, and really designing clear policy-related decision-making triggers or objective triggers where the data is available so that safety nets can link in time, trying to identify what the bottlenecks are for flow of funds and addressing them in coordination with other agencies, particularly the disaster management organizations, and in parallel, really thinking through how to link this to longer-term financial planning mechanisms and improving the inclusion angle. And I won't talk about that in much detail because our colleague before from Unicef really highlighted the case for thinking through inclusive social protection. So I'll stop here and perhaps hand it back to the colleagues in Bali. Thanks a lot for listening.
Do you want something? No. Thank you, Bu Sumati. Can you give a round of applause to Bu Sarah and Bu Sumati? Yeah, there is a few quick summary from Bu Sarah and Bu Sumati presentation. We have like at least 4 core principles in developing more sustainable financing mechanisms for ISP. But I will prefer to have like data first in the most important part, and then the timeliness of the funding, and it is also underlined that there is no single financial instruments for addressing the ISP. And the last one is we need to have like good delivery mechanisms for this benefit. And one thing that I like also is that we have to reduce disbursement bottlenecks, because it seems like during the pandemic, during the natural shocks, this one is quite challenging. So before Mr. Massimo presentations, I will need to remind you that if you want to have some questions from those who joined from the WebEx, please put it in the chat box. Then we can have your question from that. Our last presenters is Mr. Massimo, now is in Jordan at the EU Regional Office for Humanitarian Aid. He is a policy advisor in social protection, forced displacement and access. And he worked over the past 25 years for humanitarian and development institutions, including European Commission, the United Nations, and international NGOs, being posted in Balkans, Africa, Middle East, South, and Southeast Asia. Mr. Massimo will join from WebEx, and will touch on the humanitarian perspective on implementing the more adaptable and shock-responsive social protection. Mr. Massimo, you have approximately 15 minutes for the presentation, and the screen is yours. We still cannot hear your voice. Are you still on mute or? Anyone can help us with the sound system? I think you're still mute.
Hello?
Yes, okay, good. Can you
hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, but still a bit, I think it's connection problem. Okay, you can start. Yeah, it's good to start, Mr. Massimo. Mr. Massimo, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Or maybe I cannot be heard. Can you hear our sounds? The panitia sepertinya tidak terdengar ya. It seems Mr.
Hello?
Massimo cannot hear us. Can you hear us, Mr. Massimo?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I try to speak without earphone.
Okay.
Good morning, good morning and good evening for all those that are connected, and thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure and an honor to share some observation and thought on the adaptive social protection and shock responsive social protection. I have yes, please, we can go to the next slide.
Next slide, please.
I would like to spend a few words of introduction to share with you the historical change of the way how the humanitarian international institutions were step by step involved in what is today the conceptual framework of social protection. The typical entry point since the very beginning, it was to react after the crisis. It was to respond with humanitarian support to the humanitarian needs after any kind of natural disasters or conflict affected population. The logic of social protection, even within practitioners in the past, was often related to poverty alleviation, in which we do not see a clear role for us, while governments and development international institutions are already working. The significant change came, I would say, in the last 10 years, more or less. First of all, with the introduction of the policy that we had on resilience, in which the three phases, the preparedness, the during, and the post-crisis were highlighted. However, with the 2012 policy that we had, the emphasis was still on the person, the household, and the community, that usually are the clients that we support through the partners. Only in 2017, a revision of this policy included the concept of state resilience, that I think is in a very important aspect that I wanted to emphasize, in which we could expand also as a humanitarian donor our role vis-a-vis the government. And I think in the same time, we should not forget that the World Humanitarian Summit, in which we did some joint analysis and commitment with a number also of other partners with the humanitarian and development colleagues to understand better, as we say, the role of adaptive and shock responsive, what that means and what is happening today. In the slide that we see, the very last step happened between last year, 2021 and 2022, when we revised also the policy on disaster preparedness and the expansion of cash transfer. Can we go to the next slide? And here is, in a nutshell, that since the European Union emphasized that the approximately 35% of our overall budget per year should be invested in cash, and cash could be an investment that could enhance and support shock-responsive social protection, was a very clear signal that we wanted to share with our partners. Next slide. So, what is new and what we are talking about? We think that in the linkages between cash, humanitarian cash and social protection, there are a number of innovation in which we could have a role. In this slide, for instance, everything related to digitalization, interoperability, data protection are all different building blocks of an area where we see a significant change that took place recently. Please, we go to the next slide. So when we work on the sequencing of the project, what that means, as said already by other colleagues, it's very important that we try to emphasize the linkages between humanitarian and development. The famous silos approach that unfortunately it was often one of the bottlenecks for difficult times in which we couldn't really build on the investment done by the humanitarian to enhance the sustainability with the role of the development and the governments. It was often, as I said, a gap area where we couldn't really try to use the know-how of the humanitarian and the development together. And I think this is an area extremely important for what we are discussing today. Can we go to the next slide? So, where we see our added value and how we believe that ECHO, as part of the European Union and other humanitarian donors, could complement the investment already done in this particular area. For instance, the rapid response and the quick injection of funding from the humanitarians, it could be used as a tool to make it flexible systems that already exist at the time of the crisis. There are particular areas in when we talk often about the expansion of the current social protection with additional funding for the people affected by the crisis, or expanding to more people that could be supported that were not initially included because we didn't know the magnitude of that crisis for the particular population. So these are only few elements when we discuss about innovation in what we are doing that are happening in these days. But let me give you a few simple examples it's happening in a number of countries around the world in which we are directly involved. In Ethiopia, for instance, a few years ago, we decided soon after a drought to start a pilot with other colleagues of the United Kingdom in open dialogue with the World Bank and with the government of Ethiopia. It was an expansion of the famous PSNP that was at that time the biggest social protection scheme in Africa, to help them to analyze how people affected by the drought that were living in a region that was not yet covered by this system could expand and could potentially scale up for a longer term anytime that additional shocks in the future could happen. Another example happened a few years ago in Southeast Asia, where thanks to a strong partnership with the ASEAN and directly with the partners involved, we were working together in anticipatory action, in an area in preparedness, in which in the past the humanitarians invested a very limited funding, and where we see more and more with the policy development that we could complement a significant role by other partners as well. And finally, in the Middle East, where we had, unfortunately, in the last few years, large caseload of population that had to be forcibly displaced. This is another area where we tried, in partnership with the international community and with the government, to understand how we could use significant financing investment by the humanitarian to complement what was already in place in countries where the government already had social protection, and also in countries where social protection system didn't exist yet. And this is, as said before, another area where even limited funding of the humanitarian community could potentially help the expansion or the design of a system that could respond better to shocks in all the three different phases: in preparation, during the crisis, and after the crisis. So, in conclusion, just a few words to say that the European Union and ECHO is committed to support the current work that we are doing to sustain the vulnerable population in order to respond better to shocks. The last few key words that I would like to underline are partnerships. We are, I think, more and more obliged to have a stronger partnership with all the different categories of stakeholders, with no barriers between humanitarian and development. Financing. Financing is a key area where probably we should invest more in financing strategy on the short, medium, and long term. And finally, the know-how. We learned a lot over the last few years, and not always we optimize the know-how that already exists in the different institutions to support the system. And I think these are the last few words that I would like to share with you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Massimo. Can you round of applause for Mr. Massimo? There are a few, I think, what Mr. Massimo emphasized on, that the cash, humanitarian cash has become quite important part of the interventions of the ASP, especially to strengthen the resilience, to reduce impact of the shocks, and then also facilitate scaling up of the system. And there is also underlined that we have to have the multiple avenues of the innovations, including digitalizations. So now we are arrived to the question and answers and discussions. And the first opportunity I will give the audience here in the room. Any questions? Maybe the first questions? Okay, go ahead. Gentleman in the middle. Can you introduce yourself, mister?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Arif Suleiman from the Islamic Development Bank. A couple of points, and it goes for both the two speakers that are with us physically. The first one is around multidimensional poverty and its importance in identifying, the different areas, and pretty much one of the key areas that we as the Islamic Development Bank are looking at is on the area of multidimensional poverty and trying to better identify and target interventions. So in terms of that as a key area, you mentioned new financing and innovative financing tools and techniques. Any thoughts on the use of Islamic financing mechanisms such as waqf, awqaf, the issue, the instruments of sadaqah and also zakah? So that was the first one. And then on the second part of the question is specifically on the disaster risk. One of the key issues on this is the availability of accurate and timely data. Now, this is a challenge in the best of times, but unless we have granular data, very difficult for efficient evidence-based decision-making and also for the financing to be going in the right direction. So any thoughts on innovative data validation or data capturing techniques, use of Earth observation, etc.? Because clearly without proper data on this, we're navigating blind. Thank you.
Thank you. The second questions from the room? Anyone? Okay, Pak Snyder.
Thank you. Let me share about the perspective that we have from various kind of disaster. We have COVID, we have natural disaster, and probably from wars, etc., etc. I'd like to see the how can we see? Is it possible if we like to combine this one single adaptive protection system to the various kind of the disasters or the contingency? Or should we address which one is more effective and efficient actually? Should we address each risk or put it in the whole budget or under one pool regarding the money that we would like to set? And when looking at the various contingencies or the situation that we have, is it possible that, I don't know, I'm thinking about how to manage the money if the government set aside some of the budget for every year, let's say like a saving. Is it for us to manage the money the same with the other insurance company, or what is the best way to get the sustainable financing for this kind of the adaptive social protection? Thank you for that.
Thank you, Pak Snyder. Okay, I think we have 2 questions from the room, and then we are going to answer that first. We still have like around 20 minutes, yeah. And then I hope that we can answer this first session in 10 minutes. The first question is from Pak Arif from Islamic Development Bank on any thoughts of the Islamic funding such as sedekah, zakat, and then also I think the one that I underlined earlier, the availability of the data. Is it possible that we can have like timely, accurate manner of the data that can draw the policy of the ISP? I will give the opportunity for Ibu Natalia first.
Great, thank you so much for those very important questions, and I'll try to address parts of it. Maybe start with your question of multidimensional poverty. And I think for UNICEF, we definitely put a lot of attention on that, particularly because it's important to focus on the income losses, but also on the different deprivations in terms of social sectors that children and families suffer. And I think that's important, not only in identifying who is and what are the characteristics, but also what are the most effective responses to addressing poverty, which should be definitely from the economic perspective, more jobs and more economic stability, but also access to social services. And therefore, the importance of putting human capital, social services at the center of the response, enhancing education, enhancing health, and having that broader perspective. Second is, in terms of innovative financing, I think we have examples for example, in the Middle Eastern region where we've been partnering with the Islamic Development Bank and trying to leverage other types of innovative mechanisms that can support, complement, or address some of the elements, where the Sahad is definitely one of them. And we're also working in complex emergencies where we can bring also those interventions and leverage what's happening at community level. What are those mechanisms that are not maybe jeopardized by conflict or by other elements and can bring that capacity at community? And I think that's one of our challenges or one of the innovative things that we still need to do more. What are those things that exist at community and local level that we can understand, that we can better leverage to support the national structures? And there's many examples, I think, in the communities and the local government level that we need to put a bit more attention. So I think we should be working more closer together on that regard. Data, I think, is as I think our colleague in the back said at the beginning, one of the main challenges, but also the main priorities that we need to put, not only in terms of collecting data, but making sure that the data systems that already exist are talking to each other. And I think that's, for example, one immediate step. To what extent the management information system of a social protection program is effectively linked with the early warning and early preparedness that is maybe managed by another ministry. To what extent we have those two existing elements connected. And in many contexts, that's not the case. We're working in parallel. We have a very strong early warning and disaster risk type intervention and with a lot of very important data, but that's not necessarily feeding as a trigger mechanism to then have more important social protection response. In the region where I'm from, Latin America, we're starting to look at those very critical linkages, how to better integrate not only social and economic dimensions as triggers for social protection, but also the climate, the disaster, things that we know are predictable, things that we know that are going to come, and therefore being able to influence a response that it's early and not only when it's too late. Deputy Minister, I think that's the question that we need to all come together. Now, how do we understand a context that we know that unfortunately there's always predictable risk happening? We know that there's a population that is always impacted, which are usually the poorest and the vulnerable. Can we offer that intervention that we know are going to protect them throughout the year, but also provide that additional top-ups when the specific crises happen? And I think that's where we think when we think about an adaptive system. It's a system that's protecting populations that are vulnerable, that are providing that support so when they can manage their internal risks, but also to have the capacity to provide them with additional support when those elements that we know are going to happen coming. And I think that's precisely the kind of support and partnership that I think we are here to discuss. How do we make sure that we have that adequate coverage, but also the elements to make it additional top-ups when time comes, and that to make sure that the resources that are put in place for those top-ups are not an afterthought, but are part of the resources that we put aside when we invest in a social protection system, that they're part of the budget, that is part of our regular programming. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bu Natalia. I think maybe Sarah and also Bu Sumati can also address the questions from Pak Snyder on how we actually manage the funding for the ISP. Go ahead, Ibu Sarah.
Thank you very much. I'll start, and then I'll let Sumati come in to complement, I think, on a number of fronts. So I think, Pak Schneider, you touched on the key point, right? Is how do we combine and how do we protect from different types of risk? And I think the evidence globally of linking disaster risk finance, or the experience more than the evidence of linking disaster risk financing to ASP is probably slightly larger now on sort of either low onset, like not disasters like drought, or on specific shocks, but more on the disaster space, right? When we start thinking about other types of shocks, like health, we've all recently experienced, and pandemics, which will become more frequent, and we know, and also economic crisis or the impacts of some of these, I think it's more of an unknown territory. But the one, I think Sumati presented it quite clearly in terms of the idea that no single instruments will allow us to protect from all different shocks and risks. So it's important to sort of try to differentiate. And each country is different in the extent that it will be able to understand and plan for some of these shocks. But as much as we can plan ahead of time, the more room we have for those things that we cannot plan for. So I think the call here is really about pre-funding, pre-planning as much as possible, and linking to the different types of instruments. Sumati went over some of those that are low frequency but very high cost. For those, we know that some insurance mechanism might be most appropriate. For those that we know happen every year, we can set aside budget resources. And the more risks we can cover with that financial strategy, the more we'll be prepared for those events that we were not able to predict. And I think when we think about the disaster risk financing strategy as a whole, it's really about thinking about the funding sources, the mechanisms that we will use, and the regulatory linkages, if you want. Really, how can we reduce to a minimum the decision that needs to happen after the shock hits? And how can we protect in a broader set? And I think I have a few things on data, but I think Sumati will be able to answer those better. So please go ahead and.
Would you mind, Bu Sumati?
No, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So on the question around data, of course, it's the golden question. How do we solve that problem? But I think over the last few years, there's definitely more work that's gone in to trying to address this issue. So of course, the colleague from the Islamic Development Bank, Arif, mentioned the use of Earth observation data, the use of satellite data, and overlaying this with existing databases is proven to at least offer some validation of sorts to designing triggers, for example, for slow onset events. Now, something that we see is that it's important to understand the objective for which the data is needed. If it's more for decision making, there are now a suite of analytical tools that exist that are basically designed to support countries with decision making when data is scarce. And so we see obviously two things come out. One is some preliminary decisions can often be made with making assumptions based on existing data, and then it's also an opportunity to work with the country to actually start to document better information so that, few maybe decades down the road, there's adequate, at least real-time data. But in the meantime, I think the use of Earth observation and satellite data has shown to be has shown some use in the slow onset events. With the flood modeling kinds of events, which are quick onset, it still stays a challenge, though we see more and more innovations taking place. So the Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility actually designed a parametric flood trigger with kind of, creative ways that we can, of course, talk about at some point. And similarly, we see Sierra Leone, Bangladesh, Niger, all these countries investing in how to tackle the flood issue, or quick events with quick onset, how to tackle those issues to design some data-driven triggers. I think Sarah took on the questions very well of Pat Schneider on how to allocate, basically what to allocate in the budget and what to have for other types of events. I think when thinking about social protection, my one kind of view, and this comes really from government of Sierra Leone's perspective, was that to start a bit step by step, but stay flexible. So yes, set aside perhaps what you think you might need annually, but then stay flexible. So in Sierra Leone, the initial thinking was that they would actually set aside contingency reserves for their annual floods, but then COVID hit 1 month after they had done that, and they had to reorient that funding to respond to COVID. So especially for contingent financing, staying flexible, staying agile as possible, because that's not something you can get from the risk transfer instruments. They don't trigger, unless the threshold is met. So I think that's just one suggestion from my side.
Okay. Thank you, Bu Sumati. Mr. Massimo, do you have any insights of there's a question from Mr. Arif, that any experience in humanitarian cash on maybe contributions from the Islamic Fund? Mr. Massimo?
Yes, I just would like to mention that I think I would like to link this question also with the one on data that I think were both quite key for humanitarian. We are working often in countries where the social protection system, as I said, it was built in some cases for poverty alleviation, and not only to respond also to humanitarian shocks, where other people probably are in need of additional support. So the expansion of the caseload, I think, is a critical area where in a number of countries the know-how of the humanitarian contributed to what already existed in the data set already in the hand of the governmental structure. I think this is a particular area where I think we are working together. Over.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Massimo. I think we are going to take some questions from the WebEx. And this is the first question from Oktari Maharani from the Ministry of Public Works. And this is special for Ibu Natalia, I guess. And I will give you 2 minutes. What are the contributions of UNICEF in supporting the countries in improving economy during the COVID-19 pandemic? Ibu Natalia.
Thanks, Mr. Maharani, for the question. I think UNICEF has played a very important role, particularly when understanding that we were facing not only a health crisis, but a socioeconomic pandemic. And understanding what were the poverty impacts, the child poverty impacts, and also the impacts across different sectors, the immediate impacts to children, but also the potential long-standing impacts that we've been seeing and trying to avert the loss of a generation. So in terms of social protection, we were in more than 140 countries supporting governments to make sure that their systems were responding and providing particular cash support to those affected by the pandemic, but also in countries where we were not able to use systems, being able to deliver directly life-saving cash and support through parallel systems to be able to respond to that. There's also a lot of work around strengthening the return to school, making sure that children are back to school and that schools are the last to close, even in the context of the crisis. A lot of work around making sure that we have the appropriate support in terms of child protection also and health systems. A lot of work around financing and not only understanding our role in vaccinations and COVAX, but also identify what were the additional costs in the delivery of vaccines at a country level. One thing is to procure vaccines, which we had a lead role in the context of ACT8 and with other partners, but also at helping governments to strengthen their capacities to be able to deliver and administer those vaccinations at home. And currently also thinking about what is the next step and what are the key elements that we need to support as we are unfortunately probably going to continue to experience this type of crises. And having a very strong support in terms of preparedness of systems, on health systems on one side, and we have a strong work right now around public health emergencies, which is trying to identify how do we integrate the specific costs and the specific priorities on the health systems to be able to prevent and respond better to the next pandemic, as well as in terms of social protection. And of course, our commitment to shock responsive and adaptive social protection is a big part of that commitment, understanding the importance of systems, of being prepared, to being adequately financed, but also able to respond. So I know it's a very broad question and I can be here for a long time, but just maybe key points that I wanted to focus on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ibu Natalia. And this is the last questions from Ibu Februari, GIZ. For Ibu Sumati, the World Bank, in context of Indonesia, what will be the preferred risk financing instruments? Can you answer that in 1 minute? Thank you, Ibu.
Thank you, Pa. So first of all, the question should be to Government of Indonesia. So perhaps I should make this quite clear, right? That the process of developing risk finance strategies or developing the instruments is really a question about the country's risk appetite. And so it's something that countries choose and decide. And they need to understand what level of risk they want to retain on their budget, what level of risk they want to transfer to other partners, particularly the domestic and international markets. Now, in the case of Indonesia, actually, they went through this process. So the government actually developed a risk finance strategy, and I shared it in the chat for anybody who's interested. They actually developed, their policy priorities, basically assessed what instruments exist and what they want to prioritize. So currently, the government actually has an active state asset insurance program that they manage, and they're also in the process of developing a pooling fund for Bencana, PFP, which actually is going to have a link to social protection. There's many, the government can talk to it because it's their program, but one of the kind of key delivery mechanisms here would be social protection. So there will be engagement with Ministry of Finance and others on it. But I want to emphasize that the question should go to the Government of Indonesia and not to me. Back to you, Pa.
Thank you, Ibu Sumati. I guess this is coming to an end of this session. I would like to have some key points of this session, especially the one that what Ibu Natalia mentioned. ESP is actually relevant for everyone. So it's not only maybe for current poor and also vulnerable, but I think for everyone. So this actually makes the data that we already discussed during the sessions become very relevant. So this is actually related also to what we are currently doing in Indonesia. We are going to have the socio-economic registry, and that's covering for the whole population, because I think because we are so very vulnerable to every kind of shocks, then we need to have this comprehensive data. And then we also have to integrate all the risk and build from the existing programs and become more stronger ASP. And from the World Bank, we also have this timely funding, for the funding mechanisms, and then we need to have the risk layering of all of these shocks that we have, and then we need to also shaping all of the delivery mechanisms, especially how to reach the beneficiaries, and lastly is on data. I think that's all that we are already discussed. Before ending, we would like to appreciate for all the speakers, Bu Natalia, Ibu Sarah, Ibu Sumati, and also Mr. Massimo. And we also appreciate for the organizers. This is a collaboration between Unicef and also BAPPENAS. We really appreciate for this session. Hopefully, we can have fruitful discussion and also have more real follow-up from this discussion. Thank you again.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we just finished the first session of presentation and panel discussion with the panelists, and also once again thank you to our moderator for the first session, Mr. Maliki, for handling very nice session, very fruitful discussion and insightful also. And next, ladies and gentlemen, we will continue. We will continue with the next session, which is second session of discussion and presentation today. For the second panel discussion, ladies and gentlemen, the theme is designs and applications of tools for building and expanding adaptive social protection in developing countries. Yes, and we also will have a moderator for the second session. The moderator for second session is Mr. Yanuar Nugroho. He is the coordinator of expert team, SDGs National Secretariat, Ministry of National Development Planning or BAPPENAS, and also he was former Deputy Chief of Staff at the Executive Office of the President since 2015 until 2019. So ladies and gentlemen, to moderate our second panel discussion today, yes, please give a warm welcome Mr. Yanuar Nugroho. Please come up to the stage.
Pak Snyder, Pak Gas, Ibu Natali, Ibu Sarah, Ibu Yosimi, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, very good morning to all of you. Om Swastiastu. Welcome to the second part of our discussion. And I think after learning in a very interesting discussion led by Pak Maliki about the adaptive social protection from many conceptual and policy perspectives. In this session, we will be discussing the practical aspects, which is the design and application of tools for building and expanding adaptive social protection in developing countries. I'm Yanuar Nugroho, coordinator of the expert team in the National Secretariat of SDGs Implementation in the Ministry of National Planning, BAPPENAS in Indonesia. I will be moderating this second session, which I hope will be of great interest to all of you. Current crisis, including the COVID pandemic, made us realize the importance in accelerating and development and expansion of social protection. Adopting social protection that is more adaptive to a crisis can be a way of ensuring people's resilience. And as we learned from the previous session, at its core, it integrates social protection approaches with DRR, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. And we know that both are centered on efforts to reduce communities' vulnerability and increase their adaptive capacity to face sudden and slow onset covariate shocks, such as climate change and natural hazards. Many developing and least developing countries have implemented additional social protection measures in response to the crisis, both in facilitating people's access to health services and job protection and reducing income loss. However, many of these measures were ad hoc, short-term, making it difficult to sustain without a clear strategy and understanding the nature of the risk itself. There are also challenges and problems that continue to occur in ensuring that the people receive fast, timely, and adequate social protection benefits. These gaps range from financial constraints, design programs, and lack of data availability. These all, unfortunately, are also often aggravated with poor planning, weak institutional capacities, poor risk communication, inadequate early warning systems, and insufficient infrastructures to mitigate risk. So, in this session, therefore, we hope to provide deeper technical insight, support for, and commitment to G20 stakeholders on the ways in which ASP can address intersectional vulnerabilities and reduce disaster risk to build resilience, the theme of our meeting, protect and develop human capital. And in this session, we will focus on learning from country experiences, having developed and expanded adaptive social protection systems in response to COVID-19 and climate change to build resilience as well as protect and develop their human capital. We have 4 speakers in this panel, and they all will be speaking online, so you will only see me here on the stage moderating 4 people online. The panel will be kicked off by Nupur Kukreti, Social Protection Specialist, UNICEF. Nupur will share with us some diagnostics and critical considerations. Then we will have 3 country experiences in developing and expanding ASP systems. First, from the People's Republic of Mongolia, by Basan Batiargal. He is the Director of the Social Insurance Policy Implementation Coordination Department of Mongolia. Then Carlota Rego will share the experience of the Republic of Malawi in designing responsive and adaptive social protection. This is quite challenging for her because at the moment it's around 2 or 3 in the morning, 2 a.m. in the morning. Thank you very much, Carlota, for joining us. She's a social policy specialist at UNICEF Malawi. And finally, Luis Alberto de los Santos will share the experience from Dominican Republic. Luis is the head of Department of Socioeconomic Analysis at the Unique System of Beneficiaries. We will then have time for discussion. I encourage you all, both online and offline here, to join actively in the discussion. For those joining online, kindly post your questions and I will read them for the speakers. So, without further ado, let us start this panel. We will start with Nupur. Nupur, can you hear me? Just want to check.
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Nupur, you want to share with us some of your works, some diagnostics and critical considerations when a country wants to implement ASP. So, I'm afraid I can only give you 10 minutes. Please.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be talking to this esteemed group of people. Really happy to be here. Can I have my slides on the screen, please?
Can anyone help upload the slide? Okay.
Thank you very much. So let me. Thank you for the question, first of all, and let me start talking about it. Can I have the next one, please? Next slide.
Next slide. Okay, yes.
So my presentation is divided into 3 parts, quickly unpacking what adaptive social protection is, then moving quickly to UNICEF's social protection system readiness assessment tool, and then, since I work with UNICEF, key considerations for child-sensitive adaptive social protection. Can I have the next slide, please? The next one. So in the session before this one, we heard a lot about various shock responsive social protection or adaptive social protection. A simple way of looking at a social protection system is to look at the diagram that we have on the screen. It is basically concentric circles, which includes all the 4 components of a social protection system, which means that there is the critical need of evidence base, which is the basis for all the policies and programs. And I remember there was a question earlier in the earlier session about data. And this is the most critical part of a social protection system. Then we have policies that are based on the evidence base and the programs. And then around this, we have the whole administrative system of delivery mechanism, the information systems, etc., that together brings everything together into a system. Now, if we have to make the social protection system shock responsive or adaptive to shocks, we need to risk inform it. Can I have the next slide, please? And this would mean embedding an analysis of risk and shocks in data, all the data that we have on child poverty or poverty in general. What are those areas which are affected by shocks? What are the common types of shocks in our country? That forms the part of our evidence base for designing and working on adaptive social protection. Then we have policies, and again, embedding an analysis of risk into the policies and the legislative framework, the financing, which Sumati and Sarah just talked about in the previous session, and also strengthening coordination between different line ministries, but at the same time, as Natalia mentioned in the previous session, also working on coordination between the central and the local authorities, because the local authorities are the ones who are closest to where the crisis impacts most. Then again, looking at programs and tweaking the programs or adjusting the programs so that they are adaptive and are able to respond to people's needs when they need it the most. And then bringing it all together, as I said earlier, is the administrative system. The work around registries is extremely important to work on adaptive social protection, interoperability of information systems, and many more. So there are multiple layers that need to be addressed and risk informed for any social protection system to be either shock responsive or adaptive. Can I move to the next slide, please? So keeping this in mind, at Unicef, can I have the next slide, please? So keeping this in mind, as Unicef, we've been collecting information since 2017 to see what is the status of shock responsive social protection. And what we see from the information that we have is that over a period of time, we see a gradual increase in the number of countries that moving from absent shock responsive social protection to more stronger and moderate shock responsive social protection. The next one, please. And over a period of time, our focus and attention within UNICEF is to reduce the number of countries that we see right now clustered around absent or weak shock responsive social protection, and have be a part of the process to move most of these countries towards moderate as well as strong shock responsive social protection systems. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see the indicators that we use to classify strong or absent. The next slide, please. So to help us work with countries and support country governments in moving more towards shock responsive or adaptive social protection system, we have developed a tool. This tool is a simple Excel-based tool, which helps in assessing the political, technical, operational, and financial feasibility or readiness of a country's cash-based social transfer programs. It uses key informant interviews and secondary information to analyze and present information. It uses the traffic light system, as you can see, the green, yellow, and the reds, with red denoting weakness and green denoting strength of that particular component. So it really breaks down the different components into smaller bits to analyze whether that particular element is strong or weak, and then helps with collectively putting everything together to assess the stage of readiness of a social protection system to be able to respond to crisis and to help with resilience building in the longer term. It also helps with developing a roadmap. As I will be speaking later on, this is not a one-off activity. It requires a roadmap. It requires a roadmap with strong commitments over different years. So this tool it includes modules. There are 5 modules plus 1. The plus 1 is to look internally for agencies who are supporting governments in strengthening their shock responsive systems, to look internally into their own readiness. So let me move to the next slide, which highlights the 5 modules. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm not going to read all of this. I know there's a lot of information here, but just to say that the readiness assessment tool that UNICEF has includes 5 modules. The first one looks at mapping, which helps with stakeholder mapping. It provides an overview of social protection and the disaster risk management system in the country. The second one is on data and evidence, to say what kind of data on poverty and vulnerability exists, whether there is any information on early warning in the country, what is the shock profile, the seasonality of the shocks, which geographical locations are more affected. Then the third module looks at the policy, legislation, and the finance. It looks at the regulatory framework for social protection and disaster risk management, financing, vertical and horizontal coordination within the system. And the fourth module is on program design, and it goes into the details of specific programs within the social protection system. And since this tool looks a lot more at the cash transfer part of the programs, looks at the objectives and the general purpose of the program, who the target beneficiaries are, whether these beneficiaries are concentrated in areas that are impacted by crises, often the adequacy of the benefits, the comprehensiveness of the benefits. So these are the questions that the fourth module looks at. And the fifth module goes into detail on the registries and the database, the interoperability of different information systems held by the Social Protection Ministry and the ministry responsible for DRM, and also the capacity of the delivery mechanism to be able to respond at scale. The next slide, please. So this 2 minutes, is all about, yeah, I'll be quick now. So can I have the next slide, please? This tool has been applied in about 12 countries that you can see. And now moving to the key consideration, and I have 5 key considerations for child-sensitive ASP. The next one, please. So working on adaptive social protection requires a full systems approach. It is not adequate to just work on one element. As I said, there are 4 elements: the evidence base, the policy, coordination, financing, the programs, and the administration. All of them work together as a cog, as the cogs here in the diagram. If one of them gets stuck, the entire system will get stuck. So there's no point working on only one component. We have to look at it as a full system. Next slide, please. Which is the second consideration, that we have multiple actors who are extremely relevant when we talk about adaptive or shock responsive social protection. The key ones are the ones working in planning and the ones working on social protection, but at the same time, those ministries and authorities working on humanitarian. But when we talk about child-sensitive adaptive social protection, there are 2 other ministries, or 2 plus more other ministries, that are extremely important for making adaptive social protection systems more child responsive. And these are the ministries that deal directly with children's needs like health and education. So it's important that all these stakeholders are working very closely together, not just at the central level, but also at the delivery end at the local authority, local government level. The next slide, please, which is my third consideration. And often when we talk about adaptive social protection or shock responsive social protection, we talk about scaling up. Yes, that is one part of adaptive social protection, but that is not the only part. One of the most basic things that can be done in adaptive social protection, and especially if it is about child-sensitive adaptive social protection, is to ensure that the routine social protection support to the most vulnerable, particularly children, is not disrupted when a crisis happens, or it is not deprioritized if a crisis happens. Because this is when people need the support the most. So this is the basic aspect of shock responsive or adaptive social protection system, on which we can build on scaling up, we can build on tweaking and adjusting programs, but this is something which is extremely important. To my next slide, please, which is my fourth consideration, is that working on adaptive social protection is an incremental process, and so is human capital development. And if we follow a life cycle approach and blend adaptive social protection with following a life cycle approach in social protection, then it will help in incrementally building the social protection system over a period of time, along with human capital, but at the same time, building adaptiveness of the social protection system. And my last slide here, which is the fifth consideration, the next one, please, is that it's not enough to just make commitments. Commitments and political will has to be backed by resource allocation. And as I said earlier, this is a process, it's a long-term process, and which requires adequate allocation in the budget and protecting it so that when people need it the most, adaptive social protection is there to support. And this is where I would end my presentation with a plea to all the members of G20 to really think hard about all the considerations that I've put forward here, but the last one even more. So thank you so much, Mr. Yanuar, for the opportunity, and I'm available for questions later.
Thank you very much, Nupur. Let's give a round of applause for very, very interesting and very informative presentation, Nupur, especially on the diagnostics and the 5 considerations. But before we discuss, let me invite Basan to share the first country experience. Basan, could you hear me? Basan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Basan, I would like you to invite to share with us the experience in the Republic of Mongolia and specifically designing and implementing adaptive social protection. Particularly since COVID pandemic, you have somehow adjusted your current social protection schemes at the time so that it managed to help people. Would you share with us how you do it, how you did it, particularly from the policy and governance perspective? You also have 10 minutes, if you don't mind, please. Basan, please start your presentation.
Okay, if you can pull up my slide, that would be great.
Is this the right slide, Basan?
Thank you very much. In Mongolia, we have a social protection system, and during the COVID pandemic, we have implemented many welfare relief programs. And one of the biggest is the scaling up of the child money program, cash transfer program, where we have increased the benefit amount 5 times. It used to be 20,000 rupees per child per month, which is 100,000 now. And this child money program really helped us protect the child welfare during the COVID times. And in addition to that, from the welfare fund, we provide pension and benefits, and this has been increased up to 100,000, which is still continuing under operation. And in addition to that, the social insurance programs and tax concession and exemptions and also exemption and subsidies for the electricity bills and also for the cashmeres have been implemented. These are many measures we've implemented from the government. Next slide, please. Okay, and the social insurance contribution is paid by under Mongolian law by both employees and employers. The social insurance contribution during the COVID times have been exempted from the government partially. So by exempting from this social insurance contribution, we were able to increase the actual money, the payroll to the citizens on their hands. And with the increased income from their salary, the people were able to spend their money on their child welfare and their family welfare. The next slide, please. Just a sec. In addition to this, we have some penalties and fines that we impose on the employers and employees, which have been exempted fully during the COVID times. And the next big measure was to encourage the employers to keep their employees. We had the incentives per number of jobs that they have retained. And as part of this social insurance policy measure, the total cost was 929 billion Tugrux. That was the total spending. We looked at the measuring the outcome of this measure by looking at the number of people who benefit from the unemployment fund beneficiary. So during the COVID, 23,000 before the COVID, 23,000 people were on the unemployment fund benefits. But then in 2020 and in 2021, the number of people who received unemployment benefits, you can see it went up incrementally and then significantly in 2021. And so what that means is that this is an evidence that these policy measures were productive and effective. Next slide, please. And also, the government of Mongolia wanted to safeguard the income of the elderly. From February 2020, we increased the pension benefit amount. So although it was difficult to bear the spending, the government will really work hard to ensure that there's available funding in the budget. In addition to this, the one unique aspect about Mongolia is that the elderly in Mongolia, it is very common for them to collateralize their pension revenue income to get the loan. from the commercial banks. And during the COVID times, we actually carried out a loan forgiveness program for those elderly. And also, we provided 1 million tokrus cash transfer to those who haven't taken any loan from the commercial bank. And that amounted to more than 900 billion tokrus in spending. And this funding source came from mining revenue. Next slide, please. But now, in 2020, we have ongoing measures. And that is the reimbursement of 50% of the social insurance fees for the low-income population. So these low-income persons, by getting the refunding of 50% of the social insurance contribution, they will be able to spend this money on their family and their welfare. And next slide, please. So under all of these government measures, we wanted to estimate, what was the coverage level, in the population, and we got help from the National Statistics Office for this estimation. And you can see from this slide that 81% of the total households in Mongolia got covered by at least one of these government programs. Next slide, please.
2 minutes, Pasan.
And if you can actually just press, and because there will be 4 or 5 columns. And then you can see that this is the poverty rate in Mongolia. It was the 28.4%. That's the baseline. And without any of these additional measures, the scenario is such that the poverty level would have gone up to 36.7%, which is an alarming level. It could have been. And based on the World Bank and the government of Mongolia joint study, at the moment in 2020, the poverty rate is 24.7%. And we believe that we were able to at least maintain the poverty level during this difficult times with all of these additional measures from the government. Next slide, please. And now, from the government of Mongolia, we are continuing the child money cash transfer program.
1 minute.
So this is a universal program covering all children. But in addition to that, we have the employment promotion program, which the government is prioritizing more. As you can see, from 2020 to 2022, we had 5 different programs. This has become 7 programs now in the year 2020 to 2023. These are employment promotion programs. So in other words, we see that we can't always continue welfare programs over the long run. And so our priority is to enlarge in our employment promotion program so that it can help the families and the transition into their resilience and help their children. And thank you. Next slide, please.
Basan, can you be a bit quick? The time is up, please. Okay. Next slide,
please. Yes, I'm almost there.
Yeah, thank you.
So from the government of Mongolia, we have a big policy framework from welfare to employment. But of course, you know, the elderly and the disabled persons, and also child welfare and protection are not to be deprioritized at all. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide here. As you can see from this screen, that the biggest ambition and for the government of Mongolia is to make sure that there is effective and inclusive social welfare programs. And so to meet this ambition, we are looking at digitization. And we have there's 72 types of social welfare services, of which 26 have been digitized already, available, and then digital for modality, and then also for the the 34 social insurance services, 18 types of services have been digitized, and everyone has their bank card and account for those who are in the social security system, so that the transactions are seamless. And so we will continue to develop this smart system, digital systems from the government of Mongolia. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Basan. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you very much for sharing. For me, it really sheds light on how policy could respond to the need when crisis hit. And I think from Basan's presentation, we learned how important it is to have the policy on social protection that can easily adapt the situation, and we can see clearly those scenarios, and I think I like that very much. Now we turn to Carlota. Malawi has developed the so-called shock-sensitive social protection aimed at protecting people in times of shocks and crisis. Carlota, please let us know what you do in Malawi so that we can learn from your experience. Also, 10 minutes for you. Carlota, the platform is yours.
Thank you. I would like to start by acknowledging Director Patricia Simfita from the Ministry of Economic Planning and Development of Malawi, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. Could we have the presentation? Next slide,
Carlota,
please.
can you speak a bit clearer and louder, maybe closer to your mic? Just to make sure we get you right here.
Like this?
Much better. Please continue.
Yeah. So Malawi is a Southern African country with a population of 19 million people. 51% of those 19 million people are below 18 years old. And Malawi can usually be found at the top of international poverty rankings. However, economic challenges have not prevented Malawi from having a very active and innovative social protection sector. Next slide, please. Social protection in Malawi is mainly governed by the Malawi National Social Support Program, which encompasses a cash transfers program, public works, school feeding, and access to finance measures. The Malawi National Social Support Program has dedicated pillars for shock-sensitive social protection and resilience. Next slide, please. In Malawi, the term shock-sensitive social protection has been used since 2018 to encompass both adaptive and shock-responsive social protection approaches. SSSP is usually focused on ensuring the continuity of routine assistance, as well as vertical and horizontal expansions. SSSP can lead to gains on national ownership and implementation, cost effectiveness, timeliness, accountability and predictability, and to minimizing gaps in service provision. Next slide, please. However, one may still ask, why does Malawi need shock-sensitive social protection? Every year, for the last 10 years, there has been a humanitarian response deployed to address seasonal needs, affecting 1 to 2 million people. This is a chronic situation that tends to repeatedly affect the same areas of the country. And yet, stakeholders tend to organize and deploy full humanitarian operations in response to these predictable needs. Next slide, please. In addition to seasonal variations, Malawi has suffered from larger and less predictable shocks, each one of them affecting over 1 million people. Cyclone Idai, the COVID-19 pandemic, and tropical storms Ana and Gombe. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at some of the national responses to these shocks. In 2021, for the first time, the government of Malawi directly implemented both a vertical and a horizontal expansion of the national social protection system. The intervention targeted 4 districts, providing 40,000 households in need of urgent emergency assistance with temporary cash transfers and top-ups to flexibly meet their basic needs. Next slide, please. As part of the COVID-19 pandemic cash response, in rural areas, the government provided a vertical expansion to 260,000 households in all the 28 districts of Malawi. In urban areas, the COVID-19 urban cash intervention targeted over 130,000 informal workers in the 4 cities of Malawi. This was technically a horizontal expansion of the existing cash transfer program to urban areas. Next slide, please. Another example of SSSP in Malawi is the provision of floods recovery cash transfers. In 2019, following Cyclone Idai, which affected over 800,000 people, the government of Malawi vertically expanded the national cash transfer program, providing top-ups to more than 5,000 households in flood-affected areas. More recently, in 2022, tropical storms Ana and Gombe affected over 1 million people in Malawi. The government of Malawi provided cash recovery transfers through both vertical and horizontal expansions to a total of 30,000 households in 4 districts. Next slide, please. It is important to note the overlap between geographical areas with high ultra-poverty rates, recurrent food insecurity, and then the highest impacts from Cyclone Idai and tropical storms Ana and Gombe. Underlying poverty and vulnerability, coupled with extreme weather events, poses a great challenge to countries like Malawi. Hence the need to invest on longer-term approaches for responding to shocks. Next slide, please. So what are the successes then of shock-sensitive social protection in Malawi? Well, first, the government is leading and directly implementing shock responses via the national social protection system. There is also increased interministerial collaboration at all levels between the Department of Disaster Management Affairs the Ministry of Economic Planning and Development, and the Ministry of Gender, Community Development, and Social Welfare. For instance, in this photo, you can see a district social welfare officer and a disaster and rehabilitation officer jointly providing directions to their teams at district level. Next slide, please. There is also increased predictability of investments on national response mechanisms, both from government and partners, despite fiscal space limitations. In addition, the quality and innovation of national system responses has also improved. Some examples include the development of a harmonized e-payment solution for social protection and emergencies, which includes also mobile money payments, both in urban and rural areas. Next slide, please. The National Call Center, which was initially created for the COVID cash response, and also a harmonized grievance and complaints mechanism. Next slide, please. There has also been progress on the digitalization of data collection and management systems, including a social registry and management information systems. Next slide, please. Efforts have also been made to improve targeting mechanisms and the inclusivity of emergency responses. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to mention a few challenges. First, the coordination across the humanitarian, development, peace nexus, which the government, with assistance from partners like Unicef, intends to improve by developing an operational vision for sensitive social protection in Malawi. Secondly, the fragmentation of implementation and financing approaches, including with limitations to donor investments via the national systems. For this challenge, the creation of a social support fund is expected to partially address the situation. There is also need to continue investing on systems strengthening to address current limitations. For instance, for rapid onset disasters, such as floods, it is only feasible to implement recovery transfers. So there is need to improve on timeliness for rapid responses. The same can be said about large-scale response operations. Finally, the interest is to introduce adaptive and cost-effective cash plus care packages addressing multiple risks and deprivations throughout the disaster management cycle for building resilience and protecting human capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlota, and thank you very much for being punctual. Let's give a round of applause to Carlota. Thank you very much. Actually, initially we would have another speaker, which is Luis from the Dominican Republic, but apparently, can anyone confirm? Luis has not joined, no? Okay. Because Luis cannot join, so we go ahead with our Q&A. We go ahead with discussion. I know that those presenters or those speakers have presented their case, their experience, and probably more like, seminar. But I don't want to have the discussion like seminars. I really want to encourage you to address you can ask, you can comment, you can debate, you can refute. If you have any ideas, I invite you to speak, but hopefully not more than 2 to 3 minutes per person, right? Both offline here, especially, and those who are online, I'm sorry I'm given instruction that I will read your questions. So while preparing your questions online, can I ask from this part, how many of you to my right side will respond or will ask from this part? Anyone? From my right side? Any questions? Any comments from this part? Anyone? No? From this part? From this side? Anyone? You don't have any question, really? Those are very interesting presentations, actually. No question at all? Anyone from here? Okay, because there is no one asking from the room, I will read the questions online. There is one question from Al-Qadri Ajwan. Questions for all speakers. How is, maybe what he means here, what is your strategy for cooperation, especially between various countries? How can it improve various sectors, both education and economy? So if I get the questions correctly, what Al-Qadri would like to ask is the strategy, especially in involving multi-actors, multi-stakeholders, when difficult situations happen and for you to implement this adaptive social protection. That's one question. Any other questions online? If you can put it here in the screen. No? Okay. Before these questions on the strategy for collaboration or cooperation between different stakeholders and also including between different countries, and I'm going to ask once again in the room. Any questions from you? No? No? Okay. I will add one question, particularly again to all speakers, of course, but I would like to focus on how do you embed, how do you internalize, or how do you embed this ASP into your current social protection schemes. I remember the experience from Republic of Mongolia and Malawi. I would like you to help me elaborate more, because usually in the bureaucracy we need to have any initiatives through the regulatory frameworks and then through the institutional settings and accountability mechanisms. How do you do it, both in Republic of Mongolia and Malawi? And to Nupur, when you presented us the considerations, how do you take digitalization into account? So that's my additional questions to what Al-Qadri. Now let me invite three speakers. Nupur first, and then Basan, then Carlota. Please, Nupur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yanwar. Let me start by talking about the question on the strategy of bringing different stakeholders together.
Sure.
So usually when there in a country that is prone to crises, we have a humanitarian coordination mechanism, which tends to bring all the different sectors together, which are called as clusters. Of course, that's a group of humanitarian stakeholders working and trying to coordinate with each other. But then at the same time, if you're talking about adaptive social protection or shock responsive social protection, it's important equally to bring the social protection actors and the actors working on humanitarian coordination together in a coordinated manner. There are some good examples of how this bridging is happening in some countries. Maybe Carlota will talk about Malawi's experience, but I want to highlight here Madagascar, for example, where the government of Madagascar has a coordination mechanism which brings different ministries and authorities responsible for various aspects of adaptive social protection together to respond to crisis. And that has been extremely helpful at the time of COVID, for example, where there was a response plan that was developed and all the stakeholders working on responding to the crises, whether coming from a humanitarian background or development background, were working towards one plan. And that one plan includes a very clear strategy on what should be the transfer values, who will be targeted, how will they be targeted. So it was a clear way of defining and bringing all the different actors together. That's a that's one example, and I'm sure there are many more examples like that. Indonesia itself has some very interesting and exciting examples. We have examples, similar ones from Philippines close by. So there are all these coordination mechanisms. In terms of inter-country coordination on some of these, some of the crises, because, and it's a very interesting question, because some crises are not just specific to countries. And I can think about, for example, ASEAN countries, the Mekong Delta. There are crises that happen in multiple countries along that delta. Then the country that I come from, India, Nepal, India, Bangladesh are connected by rivers. When they flood, it has impacts across all the three countries. So it's really important for some kind of coordination mechanism of information sharing and also of responding between the various countries that are impacted by one single shock. So that is important. I do not have an answer in terms of what exactly exists in these countries, but I do want to highlight that in Africa, in West Africa and also in the East and Horn of Africa, there is something called the community of cash that brings together technical people from governments who work on social protection, particularly social cash transfers, to come and share experiences within that cash community. And it's a close of people from the government to share experiences with each other. And this cash coordination or cash working group is supported by the World Bank and Unicef and facilitated by these two agencies. So there are some of these mechanisms that exist to strengthen coordination at regional level, at the country level. At the global level, there's something called as the PIP, the Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board, that brings multiple stakeholders together to work together. So I will stop here. And on the issue of digitization, I would go back to the diagram that I had brought in earlier, the concentric circles, where I was talking about the administrative system, which brings the entire system together. And digitization cuts across all the four components of a social protection system: the evidence base, the policy, the programs, and the administration. Particularly important at the evidence-based side and the administrative side in collecting data. I think there was a question earlier in the previous session about how do you collect data in real time. Technology and digitization actually is extremely important at that point, and then also in terms of interoperability of systems, strengthening of the information systems, the registries, and then the digitization of the delivery, especially when it comes to cash. We've seen a lot of innovation in terms of how cash can be delivered fast and safe and in a very risk-informed way through digitization. So digitization, I would say, cuts across everything. It's one of the fulcrums these days for a strong and effective adaptive social protection system. So over from me on this.
Okay, thank you very much, Nupur. I see one hand raised here to my right side, but I will now invite first quickly Basan and Carlota to respond to the questions on the strategy of engagement, different stakeholders, and also how your experience based on your countries, how you transform or how you moved from your usual, traditional, conventional social protection into ASP, how you do it within your bureaucracy. So quickly, Basan, please, and then Carlota.
Thank you very much. I'm going to respond on behalf of Mr. Basan Bacharvat. The currently government of Mongolia is in a transition phase of developing its targeted national programs under the vision of 2050. And this is also, we see as a strategic momentum for the country to embed the learning we had during the pandemic periods into our programs in a way that it definitely responds to different types of shocks. Perhaps generally that's what we can say. And I guess I would like also to echo colleagues around the digitalization of the programs. That's also a learning we had when we've been implementing different social protection programs and seeing that synergy and harmonization actually of different digitalization and databases could also help actually on a greater targeting, on greater outreach for the social protection and other services. Definitely, I guess, as it has been stressed in this session, it's not only social protection crisis, it is a socio-economic crisis, and Mongolia quite dependent on the import and export of goods in terms of revenue and import of goods in terms of the livelihoods overall. Definitely, we also see that there is a need for more across the country cooperation, and this is another focus and priority which we are looking at. Over.
Okay. Anything else you want to add? Thank you. I think that's quite clear. Can I move to Carlota? Carlota?
Thank you.
Carlota?
Yes. So, can you hear me?
Now I can. Please.
Thank you. So starting with the question on strategy, I would refer to what Nupur was mentioning regarding the existing humanitarian coordination mechanism. However, it's true that we are also working together with different stakeholders for revamping pillar meetings for shock-sensitive social protection and resilience under the Malawi National Social Protection Policy. In those meetings, both disaster risk management, humanitarian and social protection actors meet, and there is a space for discussions with a greater level of detail that would not really be possible under the humanitarian clusters meetings. And the other difference is that these meetings are always activated. The meetings happen throughout the year. So that allows for discussions regarding preparedness and systems strengthening and lessons learned. And then the cash working group has also been mentioned, which is critical, especially in working on resilience and cash plus together with NGOs, especially. In relation to cross-country collaboration also, it is important to mention that this is very relevant for Malawi because of the porosity of the border with Mozambique. And it is an issue that we have encountered a number of times when trying to organize shock responses and building on issues of interoperability of systems. Because the shock-affected populations that can be found in Malawi at a given point in time might actually not be registered under the national ID of Malawi because they might actually be Mozambicans. However, the porosity of the border is such that the communities are the same and they're affected by the same disasters. So issues of coordination and discounting are definitely something to continue working on. Looking forward. Regarding how to embed SSSP into existing social protection mechanisms, as I was mentioning, the first area is to include it on national policy, and in Malawi we have this since 2018 with the MNSSP2 that has dedicated pillars for SSSP and resilience. But also the partners have been committing resources for shock-sensitive social protection from the moment of designing their social protection intervention with pre-allocation of funds and pre-agreed triggers. And one example that I can give that Massimo knows is the European Union program SOCHOR, developed back in 2017. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Previously, I saw one hand on my right. This is your last chance, because it's the last round. Okay? Apart, or in addition to this gentleman, anyone else would like to comment? Any comments? Any questions if you have? Again, this is your last chance. 3, 2, 1. Sir, please introduce yourself and address your questions.
Just to break the ice from the audience side, because you all
Thank you very much.
Two parts to the question. I'm Arif Suleiman from the Islamic Development Bank. The issues are on lessons learned, and two parts to this. The first part is on building the safeguards to minimize leakages from the system. So any lessons learned and anything that the panelists could share on that. And the second issue is around institutionalizing monitoring and evaluation on the effectiveness of some of the safeguards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important. How we can basically not only build the safeguards, but also how integrate that into the system. Okay, I'm being kind and generous here. Any other questions? If not, I will ask all speakers to address these questions and to deliver your, not final, but your concluding remarks for this session. All speakers, please. So I will start with Nupur, and then with Basan or colleagues in Republic of Mongolia, and then finally with Carlota. So again, the questions is on the safeguards, okay? And then please let us know what you think and what is the message you want all the participants, both online and offline, can take away with them, especially during this G20 Development Working Group's deliberations. Please, Nupur, you can start, and then Basan, and then Carlota.
Thank you, Mr. Yanuar. And if you may allow, I also want to take a small question that is here on the screen in the chat box about the role of CSOs. And maybe I start with that, come to safeguards, which I think the country offices are better placed to answer from their experience. And then I'll come with my 1 point or 2 points as the closing, concluding remarks for me. So quickly coming on the role of CSOs, I think that's a very important point that you've raised online. CSOs play a big role, but also to remember that social protection is the responsibility of the state. It's the government responsibility, and governments are in the driving seat for all efforts around social protection system building, etc. Yes, CSOs, UN agencies, development partners, they can all play a role in facilitating the government to build and strengthen adaptive social protection systems. Now, some of the areas where CSOs can play a big role is around highlighting the role of poverty and vulnerability and influencing the policy and programs within the social protection system, making them more responsive to risks, is something that analysis can be brought out and highlighted to the government to draw their attention towards working on social protection systems. The other element could be around accountability and accountability to affected populations and strengthening the grievance redress mechanisms that sometimes we find are not extremely strong. At the same time, building evidence and doing proof of concept pilot programs that could be then used and to influence the larger system changes. So there's a whole range of interventions that not just CSOs but all the development partners can play in supporting the government to implement adaptive social protection systems. So I will end that answer here, but coming to the question of safeguards, and I do hope that the colleagues from country offices are able to answer this better, but we do find situations where the systems are a bit weak, and particularly in extremely fragile contexts. And these are contexts where we, if we have to support people by scaling up or tweaking the social protection system, or even to maintain a regular social cash transfer, which may have stopped because of the crisis or before the crisis. Some of the ways of doing that within UNICEF, at least I can speak of UNICEF here, is where we follow a very risk-informed approach. We have a risk matrix that we follow to analyze various kinds of risks. Based on that, we decide on what would be the delivery mechanism. In a certain context, it could mean working with the government, providing the financial resources to the government to respond to a crisis. But at the same time, in certain contexts where the risk element is extremely high, and this is very few cases, I must say, and that also in particularly very fragile context, which is where UNICEF then takes on the responsibility of providing the financial resources directly to the beneficiaries on behalf of the government, but at the same time working on the beneficiary registry and identifying who the people are together with the government, but delivering it directly to manage the risk. And in other cases, it could also be just embarking on a completely parallel program. And something which I forgot to mention in my presentation earlier is that humanitarian responses will still be needed even if we have very strong adaptive social protection systems to fill gaps. So there is this full range that UNICEF uses to manage different kinds of risks and different kinds of contexts. So with that, I've answered the question, and the last concluding point that I want to make here is that it's important to work on adaptive social protection systems, and adaptive social protection systems are not just about scaling up of programs. It is also about maintaining the routine social protection programs so that they respond to the needs of people when they need it the most. And it's extremely important at the same time to back commitments made at various forums with adequate resourcing. Without resources, nothing moves, and especially in the context of adaptive social protection systems, we're talking about a long drawn process. So it's not about 1 year intervention or a one small little tweak here and there. It's about a system change, which requires longer term commitment and resourcing to back that. And I really hope that we have policymakers from G20 listening to this presentation and would back the commitments with the resources. So with that, Mr. Yanwar, I hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Nupur. Thank you. Now, let me turn to Basan, or colleagues in the Republic of Mongolia, for the one questions from our colleagues from the Islamic Development Bank, and another questions on, now you can see maybe on your screen, the question is about the role of CSOs in implementing civil society organizations, in implementing ASP, and then maybe your key takeaway for the participants. Please.
Thank you.
Please.
So for Mongolia, the major learning for us is really to build on the existing system and improve the efficiency and alignment of the current systems to the shocks and being ready to respond to the needs of people in different situations. We also see the need for actually coming up with the different modalities, and again, where do we raise the funds and where these resources come from? This is again the questions that arise along the implementation of these programs, and this is also something which we need to be also looking at. Definitely very good question around the M&E, because it's not only actually expansion of the program and its implementation, but it's again going along with the adjusting the M&E modalities, and where we see the digitalization of the services help us in seeing the outreach of the program, how it affects the well-being and welfare, and that's why we also worked, for example, closely with the National Statistics Office on implementing the telephone-based frequent surveys, at least to monitor the outcomes of the reach out of the services. However, still we need to come up with more precise, let's say, M&E schemes. That's what we're also working with the support of Unicef on different operating procedures for implementing different programs, as well as on monitoring. So yeah, and as I said, we are in a very much transition period where we are looking at the future planning as well as future budgeting, and those would still need to embed all the considerations we have, what we have learned from this shock responsive interventions. In terms of CSOs, I guess it also depends on the nature of the program. Most welfare and cash transfer programs are run by the state itself, and monitoring is also done in state of emergencies by the state. However, for the child protection, for example, services, we do heavily rely on CSOs. I mean, children, Mongolian children stranded abroad, not being able to come during the lockdown times, etc. All those type of services were done in a very close cooperation with the different CSOs, both national and international, because, I mean, when children are stranded in different countries, that's also require a greater cooperation between the countries and more synergy between the programs as well as the countries. So the takeaway message is we need to be ready. Yeah, and just to get ready, we really need resources for that. And we have to have a real commitment in understanding how evolving different socioeconomic, political situations would affect people. And when we put the people in the center and children in the center, I guess we would come up with a good, definitely, models and approaches to it. And I guess it's very important that also countries in the region work hand in hand, because especially the climate-related disasters reach out, not a single country, but across the region. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now, can I ask and invite Carlota for your response to these two questions and also your takeaway message. Carlota?
Thank you. I would like to start with the issue of minimizing leakages from the system. So I can give an example of how we supported the government of Malawi to deliberately include households headed by children on shock responses, for instance, by using the list from the Department of Child Affairs, and also the inclusion of persons with disabilities using similar mechanisms. So throughout the collaboration of social protection and the humanitarian partners, and actually looking into what government actually has available, but it's an information that they're not always using, trying to get the best possible impact for those who are more vulnerable at times of shocks. In terms of institutionalizing M&E processes, we are working together with different government units, trying to get them to collaborate more closely. For instance, developing data collection questionnaires jointly, but it's a work in progress. And then for independent evaluations, as UNICEF, we are launching a 10-year longitudinal impact evaluation, looking into these aspects. So looking forward to the results. Finally, on the role of CSOs, the NGOs in Malawi are, I mean, the third sector is quite large. So historically, they were implementing some of the shock responses that was highlighting on my presentation before, such as the annual in-season response, which are the current shocks that happens every year. So gradually, the NGOs were removed from that space as government was being able to deliver better and at a lower cost. And the NGOs have been pushed to an area where they need to innovate and also complement government interventions, for instance, with cash plus innovative approaches, so that they focus on the areas where they can really have an impact, complementing what's already there from the government side. So in relation to this, my key takeaway would be that there is a key role for donors on investing on national systems for the activities that governments can really do and can deliver with quality, with innovation, and with cost efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Everyone, please join me in giving a round of applause for all speakers. Really, thank you very much. Friends and colleagues, we have discussed ASP in this session from a much more technical, practical, and implementation perspective. I don't think I can do justice to the richness of this discussion, but I note down here some keywords. One, this is government-led initiative. Don't forget, ASP is government-led initiative. It means we need the active role, leadership of the government to make sure that this works, this happens. Why? Number two, because in order to embed ASP into current ASP, Adaptive Social Protection, into current social protection policy, it needs much intergovernmental coordination. We know the importance of ASP, especially now we realize the scarring effect. You know, if you have a wound, it will leave a scar here, right? There are scarring effects of this pandemic, of this crisis, and we need to address that because the vulnerables will suffer. Number three, hence, it is important as well to make sure we have strategy in engaging different stakeholders, including CSOs. In order to do that, next, government overall, working together with development partners, we need to focus on how we strengthen the system, how we mobilize resources, how we ensure financing. Last but not least, we are now living in a digital age. We need to make sure that digitalization helps, not hinders what we are doing. So with this, I do hope that the richness and depth of our discussion has equipped us not just with a better and deeper understanding in implementing ASP, their challenges and ways to address and overcome them, but also a spirit and commitment across the G20 countries and beyond to respond to this call. We put it there, right? Because I think it is of paramount importance to ensure that through adaptive social protection, we not only protect our people, especially those in need and vulnerable, leaving no one behind, but with an awareness that by doing so, we actually protect our future. Because future is there, neither to be predicted nor forecasted, but to be shaped. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for our moderator, Mr. Yanuar Nugroho. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, may we have your big round of applause for the moderator and also panelists at the second session just now of our panel discussion. Thank you for the insightful discussion and also the precious occasion of G20 Indonesia Presidency in Bali, ladies and gentlemen. And now, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we believe it has been a productive morning for those joining us from the other part of the world with enlightening insights during the panel discussion. And now we arrive at the closing session. I would like to invite the practice leader for human development for Indonesia and Timor-Leste of World Bank to deliver his closing remarks. We have Mr. Ahim Smilan. Yes, we have Mr. Ahim Smilan to deliver his closing remarks. Mr. Ahim, time is yours.
Selamat siang, and may I please check if you can hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Selamat siang, semua. Once again, a very good afternoon. Pa Schneider, Pa Robert, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my sincere pleasure to give very short closing remarks after this really enlightening side event. This morning, I would like to start by thanking Unicef, BAPPENAS, as organizers of this event for really putting ASP as an important topic on the agenda, and I would like to thank all speakers and participants for their really illuminating contributions. Adaptive social protection is a core area for realizing the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's fantastic to see that Indonesia uses its G20 presidency to discuss this topic so that we can all learn from each other, and that at this side event for the Development Working Group, we had a chance to learn more both about the fundamental concepts and practical applications this morning. For me, the call for action at the center of this side event really resonates. I think it resonates with what the World Bank is doing, what our mission is, as well as partners. And it was really important for me that this event once again highlighted and really made it very specific that adaptive social protection is a crucial, important policy instrument for inclusion, but also for promotion. I think that is something that I found very important to learn, and is something, as the World Bank, we emphasize again and again, that adaptive social protection can really allow households to refrain from negative coping strategies, but instead even use disasters or other periods of stress to preserve their human capital, or maybe eventually even build their human capital, and thus is really a key ingredient for development and therefore a productive investment was also highlighted. I also found it very interesting to see that we really had very common themes that were highlighted again and again to all the presentation, including the key building blocks of adaptive social protection in terms of data and information, in terms of programs and delivery systems, in terms of finance, and also institutions and partnerships. And of course, the side event as such was also a live example, so to say, of institutions and partnerships, in particular partnerships and actions. So I'm very eager to continue this conversation. I do see the side event as basically one milestone, part of a longer conversation with the government of Indonesia, with other governments as part of G20 and other forums, as well with development partners, CSOs, NGOs, private sector, etc. The World Bank looks forward to continue to be part of this conversation and to continue to support the government of Indonesia and governments across the world as they realize their development objectives related to social protection. Thank you so much. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahim Smilan. Terima kasih banyak for your closing speech just now. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we also will have here on the stage the Director of Social Policy and Social Protection of Unicef, also to deliver her closing remarks. Ms. Natalia Winderossi, the stage is yours.
So I'm going to start, of course, by thanking the G20 presidency, the government of Indonesia, for its vision and commitment to this area of work. Adaptive social protection is critical, and I think it's been very important to put it at the center stage of this third development working group meeting. Also to thank our partners, the bank, the EU, not only for being partners in this side event, but I think as a collective we've been working very hard across many years to make sure that social protection is identified, is recognized, and is put at the center stage for really the acceleration of the Agenda 2030 and many of the new challenges that we're facing as a collective. Many thanks to the government of Malawi, of Mongolia, the Dominican Republic, as I know that we're working very hard in putting together those critical examples that we've been able to share and hear up today. And that I'll bring in some of the concrete ways where this particular approach is being implemented at country level, it's possible and it's feasible. And thanks a lot to also my colleagues in UNICEF, if I may say so, from the Indonesia office, but also the Malawi office and HQ, that have helped to shape this event together. I'm not going to do a summary, but I really wanted to maybe focus on a couple of highlights that for me were critical. First, it was a very rich and timely session. I think we've been talking about social protection for many years, but the current crises, both COVID, but also the multiplicity of climate and conflict events, the current food crisis is really putting at the center the importance of highlighting what social protection brings to the table. It's not the panacea or what is going to solve every single issue, but it's definitely a strategy that is going to help particularly the poorest and the most vulnerable to be able to better manage multiple crises and eventually have resilience around them. I think it was critical from our different sessions that social protection has a role in preparedness, in response, but also in resilience building. And we need to see it as that collective approach, that is not just a short-term emergency type intervention, but it should be a critical pillar of what we're doing in terms of inclusive recovery. I think I heard a lot of alignment in the presentations in terms of system building, investing in preparedness, the importance of coverage, but also of adequacy, that there's no one solution. You know, we saw protection of routine measurement, we saw horizontal and vertical expansion, we saw different ways of using social protection to respond to multiple crises, as well as the way that it's financed. I think all of the country examples were very clear that there was political will and commitment, there was a recognition, there was resources that were allocated, and that allowed for responses to happen, but it also thought how important it was to bring different actors together at a government, from the government perspective, so multiple sectors coming together, prioritizing social protection, but also development actors coming together with their specific expertise in supporting governments to make sure that the response is the most effective and most useful. And I think this is the case across different regions. So this is not just a priority in low developing countries, but also in middle income and high income countries, how we're going to continue to work together to make this response critical. I think one important message that I also got was the importance of having predictable financing. So integrating risk-informed financing as part of our development and design of social protection programs. That it's not something that we think where a crisis happens, but it has to be embedded from the beginning when we're designing the systems. That we have either contingency mechanisms, contingency funds on savings that allow us to better respond in a much more effective and immediate way. And of course, the different mechanisms are going to happen based on the crisis and based on the context, but those need to be embedded on that. The evidence is clear, the potential is clear, the examples and the results are also clear. And I think that right now it's a recognition that it's put on the table from the development, the humanitarian, the sustainability side. And I think it's the moment for this call for action to really be at the center of our commitments at the end of this week, I would hope. UNICEF continues to work in this area and of course recommits and reaffirms its commitment to work hand in hand, not only with the government of Indonesia, but with all the G20 partners to support the development of the systems, but also to share the expertise that is very rich across different countries on what is possible and how much we can share and cross-fertilize to also support other countries that are maybe struggling in this regard. I thank you very much for the support and looking forward to a very exciting next couple of days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Windorowski, for the closing remarks. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of today's program. On behalf of the committee, once again, we thank you for your attention and active participation since this morning until afternoon now. And we apologize for all the shortcomings. And once again, we thank you so much for the participation. And after this, we would like to invite you all to please enjoy the lunch that provided at the Seminyak Lounge mezzanine floor. Okay, I'm Putu Desi Fridayanti. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Om Shanti 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 Om. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.